There are men history remembers by the monuments raised in their name, and there are men history remembers because of what they left behind, not in bronze or stone, but in silence, in the absence where millions of lives once moved, in the space between the names on a list and the human beings those names once described. Ernst Kaltenbrunner left behind exactly that kind of silence, a silence so vast, so complete, and so deliberately constructed that for years after the war ended, the world barely knew his name. He stood 6 feet and 4.5 inches tall, a towering, scar-faced lawyer from a small Austrian town who rose from obscurity to command the most feared security apparatus in the history of the modern state. He did not achieve this through battlefield glory or political charisma. He achieved it through patience, ruthlessness, and an almost mechanical dedication to the destruction of anyone deemed an enemy of the regime he served with near religious conviction. And yet when Allied journalists tried to find a photograph of him at the Nuremberg Trials, they could not. The Reich's own official photographer had nothing usable in his extensive files. Newspaper editors ran the wrong man's face in their coverage. For a man who controlled the Gestapo, the criminal police, the foreign intelligence services, and the administrative apparatus of mass murder across an entire continent, Ernst Kaltenbrunner had achieved something almost impossible. He had remained invisible. This is the story of how he got there. It is a story about a boy from the Austrian provinces who grew into something the world had never quite seen before. A man who wore the title of lawyer and the values of a killer, who could cite legal precedent in the morning and sign execution orders in the afternoon. A man who sat at the very top of the machine that murdered millions, and who, when finally brought to account, looked the judges in the eye and denied everything. If you are watching this late at night, if the world feels too loud and you need somewhere quiet to rest your mind, this documentary is built for those hours. The narration is measured, the pacing is slow and deliberate, but understand what you are resting with: the full, documented, historically verified account of one of the most consequential and least understood figures of the Second World War. He matters, and understanding him, his origins, his choices, and his end, helps us understand how ordinary systems produce extraordinary cruelty. Stay with us. There are 18 chapters ahead. We begin at the beginning, in a small town beside a river, in the last years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where a lawyer's son was born into a world that was already beginning to crack apart. If this documentary is helping you sleep and learn, consider subscribing and ringing the bell. Every chapter will be here when you need it. And if you want to go deeper, the full playlist is pinned in the description below. Chapter 1. The Lawyer's Son. Origins. In a fractured empire, the town of Ried-im-Innkreis sits in the upper Austrian countryside. A quiet, orderly place of modest streets and provincial ambitions, nestled not far from the River Inn that forms the border between Austria and Bavaria. It was the kind of town where family lineage mattered, where a man's profession defined his social standing, and where the political upheavals gathering momentum across Europe still felt, in the early years of the 20th century, like distant noise. Into this world, on the 4th of October 1903, a boy was born to Hugo Kaltenbrunner, a practicing lawyer, and his wife, Theresia. They named the boy Ernst. The family roots were in farming. Generations back, the Kaltenbrunners had worked the land, but Hugo had crossed into the professional class, and his household carried with it the cultural weight of educated, nationalist, German-speaking Austria. The world the infant Ernst entered was one already straining under the pressure of its own contradictions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire of 1903 was an enormous, creaking, multi-ethnic construction, a patchwork of languages, loyalties, and competing nationalisms, held together by imperial tradition and Habsburg authority. For German-speaking Austrians in particular, there was a powerful current of feeling that their culture, their language, and their identity were somehow superior to the other nationalities within the empire. Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Slovenes, and yet were also under threat from them. This feeling had a name: Pan-Germanism. It was not yet a political party. It was a cultural mood, a way of understanding the world as a racial and civilizational struggle, in which the German-speaking people occupied a special, elevated position. Hugo Kaltenbrunner was an adherent of these ideas, and he raised his son inside them. The walls of the Kaltenbrunner household were, in an intellectual sense, already decorated with the beliefs that would one day make his son famous for the worst possible reasons. Ernst spent his earliest years not in Ried, but in the nearby market town of Raab, where the family relocated during his childhood. It was a smaller, quieter place, and it was there that the boy received his first years of schooling. He was, by all accounts, physically imposing from an early age, large for his age, broad-shouldered, already displaying the physical presence that would define him as an adult. His father moved the family again to the city of Linz on the Danube, the administrative capital of Upper Austria, and it was in Linz that Ernst Kaltenbrunner received his secondary education at the State Realgymnasium, a rigorous academic institution where the curriculum was demanding and the social expectations of the student body were thoroughly nationalist. Linz was a city with particular significance in the cultural imagination of Austrian Pan-Germanism. It had also been the childhood home of a certain art student who would later reshape the world. Adolf Hitler had grown up in the same city, attended schools in the same streets, breathed the same particular strain of Austrian nationalist ideology. That Kaltenbrunner and Hitler shared this formative geography was not coincidence. It was the product of a specific cultural ecosystem. The young Kaltenbrunner completed his secondary education in 1921 and enrolled almost immediately in the University of Graz. His first instinct was chemistry, a subject that appealed to his methodical, analytical mind. But within 2 years, he had transferred to law, a discipline that suited him better, combining logical precision with the exercise of authority. It was at Graz that Kaltenbrunner's political formation accelerated and sharpened. He joined the Arminia fraternity, a student organization steeped in pan-German nationalism, and he threw himself into campus politics with a ferocity that went beyond academic interest. He participated in demonstrations against Marxism and against what he and his fraternity brothers characterized as the corrupting influence of clerical power in Austrian public life. He became a fencer, a competitive one, and the dueling scars that would mark his face for the rest of his life were acquired in those university years, though some accounts suggest they may have come from a driving accident. Whatever their origin, those scars became, over time, a physical signature, a visual shorthand for the hardness the man cultivated so carefully. It was also at Graz that Kaltenbrunner encountered something that would shape the texture of his adult life far more than any academic course: the world of secret, underground, paramilitary organizing. The nationalist fraternities of the 1920s in Austria were not simply debating clubs. They were training grounds, social networks that blurred the line between student politics and paramilitary preparation, between ideological debate and organized violence. Historian Peter Black, who wrote the most detailed biography of Kaltenbrunner, describes him in these years as bored, lonely, and unfulfilled by ordinary provincial life, a man who found in the energy of organized radical politics the sense of belonging and purpose he could not locate elsewhere. This psychological portrait matters because it offers a more honest account of radicalization than the simpler story of a man born evil. Kaltenbrunner was not born anything exceptional. He was shaped, incrementally, by the culture around him, a culture that rewarded hardness, punished doubt, and offered belonging to those willing to commit fully to its demands. He obtained his doctorate in law in 1926, a genuine academic achievement for a man still in his early 20s. He worked briefly at a law firm in Salzburg before returning to Linz to open his own practice. In the summer of 1929, he joined the Heimwehr, a right-wing paramilitary formation with close ties to what would later become the illegal Nazi SA and SS in Austria. Black writes that this membership fused Kaltenbrunner's emotional need for community with his political convictions in a way that nothing else had. He was no longer merely a man with opinions. He was a man with a network, a uniform, and a cause. The lawyer's office in Linz became, slowly, a secondary concern. His real work was beginning somewhere else entirely. There is a childhood connection that deserves brief mention here, one that history has preserved with a certain grim irony. Among Kaltenbrunner's childhood acquaintances in Linz was a boy named Adolf Eichmann. The two did not grow up together in any sustained way, and the connection should not be overstated, but they inhabited the same provincial world, the same cultural atmosphere, and they would later find each other again at the very highest levels of the apparatus that carried out the systematic murder of European Jews. That two boys from the same streets of Linz ended up in those positions is not a curiosity. It is a data point about the culture that produced them both. By the time Kaltenbrunner crossed into his late 20s, the world he had grown up in was itself dissolving. The global economic depression that followed the crash of 1929 had devastated Austria as it had devastated everywhere else. Unemployment, social fracture, the collapse of faith in democratic institutions. In Linz, in Upper Austria, in the provincial towns that had shaped Kaltenbrunner's sense of the world, the old order was visibly failing, and in the gap left by that failure, radical movements, on both the left and the right, were rushing to fill the space. For a man already ideologically committed, already networked into paramilitary organizing, already convinced that history was a racial struggle and that the German-speaking peoples were both chosen and threatened, the 1930s were not a crisis. They were an opportunity. On the 18th of October 1930, Ernst Kaltenbrunner joined the Nazi Party. His membership number was 300,179. The following year, he joined the SS. He was 28 years old. His real life, in the terms that history would later use to define him, had begun. Chapter 2. The Underground Man. Building an Illegal Empire in Austria. To understand what Ernst Kaltenbrunner did in the years between his joining the SS in 1931 and the annexation of Austria in 1938, you have to understand what the Austrian Nazi movement actually was in that period. It was not a legal political organization with offices and election campaigns. It was an underground network, illegal, hunted, operating in the shadows of a state that was actively trying to destroy it. The Austrian government, under Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, had banned the Nazi Party in 1933 and was pursuing its members with the machinery of law enforcement and state power. For Kaltenbrunner and his comrades, this was not a deterrent. If anything, it was an accelerant. The repression of their movement confirmed everything they believed about the corrupt, anti-German nature of the Austrian state they intended to replace. Kaltenbrunner became, in these years, something more specific than a believer. He became an operator. His role within the illegal SS in Austria was initially that of a legal advisor, using his law degree to provide free counsel to SS and SA members who had been arrested for what the movement characterized as simply performing their duty. This was not a passive role. It placed Kaltenbrunner at the intersection of the underground network and the Austrian legal system, giving him detailed knowledge of how the authorities operated, where their weaknesses were, and how to minimize the legal exposure of the movement's activities. By 1932, he had been appointed as a legal consultant to SS Section 8, one of the regional units of the Austrian SS, and he was simultaneously running the National Socialist Lawyers League in Linz. The man who would one day command the entire Reich security apparatus was learning his trade from the ground up, using the tools of the law to protect men who were working to overthrow it. The first serious collision between Kaltenbrunner and the Austrian state came in January 1934, when he was arrested and sent to the Kaisersteinbruch detention camp, along with hundreds of other Austrian Nazis, following a conspiracy uncovered by the Dollfuss government. What happened next is revealing. Kaltenbrunner did not collapse under the pressure of imprisonment. He organized. He led a hunger strike among the detained Nazis, protesting the camp's conditions, the inadequate food, the poor sanitation, the treatment by the guards. The strike worked. The government, calculating the political cost of a mass prisoner death from starvation, released 490 of the party members. Kaltenbrunner had turned a defeat into a tactical victory through patience and organization. The lesson he drew from this experience, that pressure, applied methodically and collectively, could force concessions from even hostile authorities, was one he would carry for the rest of his life. He was arrested again in 1935, this time on charges of spreading Nazi propaganda to the Austrian military. The original charge was dropped, but he was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 6 months in prison. More damaging for his civilian life, he lost his license to practice law. This was, in the narrow sense, a professional catastrophe. A qualified lawyer in his early 30s, stripped of his ability to work in his own field, imprisoned by the state he despised. By any ordinary measure, this was the end of a conventional career. Kaltenbrunner did not experience it that way. He was increasingly operating in a world where the conventional career had become secondary. His real work, building the underground SS infrastructure in Austria, continued regardless of what any Austrian court said about him. And crucially, Himmler insisted he stay. While many of the other arrested and harassed Austrian Nazis fled across the border to Germany, Kaltenbrunner remained in Austria at Himmler's direct instruction. The Reichsführer SS had identified Kaltenbrunner as too useful to lose from the field. From the middle years of the 1930s, Kaltenbrunner's network began to expand and professionalize. He ran SS Section 8 from Linz, while maintaining regular contact with the SS leadership in Germany. Trips undertaken clandestinely, hidden on trains and boats crossing to Passau, carrying detailed intelligence reports about Austrian politics, foreign policy, and military dispositions back to Himmler, Heydrich, and their associates. He photographed confidential Austrian government documents in the autumn of 1936. He coordinated the movement of money and orders across the border. He was, in the language of a later era, running an intelligence operation, gathering information, building networks, managing the human geography of the underground. By January 1937, Himmler had seen enough. He appointed Kaltenbrunner chief of the entire Austrian SS. The underground empire had its leader. The appointment came with immediate consequences. Austrian authorities, recognizing the promotion, arrested Kaltenbrunner again on charges of heading the illegal Nazi relief office in Oberösterreich. He was held through much of 1937 before being released in September. Each arrest, paradoxically, strengthened his standing within the movement. In the culture of the underground SS, prison was a credential. It demonstrated commitment, willingness to sacrifice, and, crucially, reliability under pressure. A man who had been arrested multiple times and had not broken, had not informed, had not abandoned his post, was precisely the kind of man that Himmler valued. Kaltenbrunner's willingness to absorb punishment without cracking was not simply stubbornness. It was the quality that made him genuinely trusted by the men above him. There is something worth sitting with in this portrait of the pre-war Kaltenbrunner. He was not, in these years, a figure of dramatic public evil. He was a provincial lawyer turned underground organizer, methodical, patient, personally courageous, in the particular way that ideological commitment makes a man courageous, willing to endure physical hardship for a cause he genuinely believed in. The ideology he served was monstrous, but the man serving it was, by the standards of the underground world he inhabited, performing with distinction. This is the uncomfortable complexity at the heart of his story. The qualities that made him effective, patience, organizational intelligence, personal toughness, reliability, were not in themselves extraordinary. They were the ordinary qualities of a capable professional applied to an extraordinary project of destruction. By the winter of 1937, going into 1938, the pressure on Austria had become immense. Hitler's Germany was economically and militarily powerful, internationally assertive, and ideologically emboldened. The Austrian Nazi underground, which Kaltenbrunner now led, was a ready instrument for destabilization from within. The Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, who had replaced the assassinated Dollfuss, was attempting to maintain Austrian independence against enormous pressure. He had traveled to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in February 1938 and had been subjected to hours of intimidation, ultimatums, and threats. He returned to Vienna, shaken, knowing that the men demanding Austria's absorption into Germany had both the will and the means to take it. And he knew that inside Austria itself, an entire secret infrastructure, the network Kaltenbrunner had spent 7 years building, was ready to move the moment Berlin gave the word. The year 1938 was approaching, and for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, everything he had worked toward in the underground, every arrest endured, and every border crossed in darkness, was about to pay off in ways that would transform his life beyond recognition. The Empire of Shadows was about to step into the light. Chapter 3. The Anschluss. Reward and Responsibility. On the 13th of March, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria. There was no battle. There was no organized military resistance. The Wehrmacht entered a country that had, in the days immediately preceding, been systematically stripped of its will to resist. Through a combination of external pressure, internal subversion, and the calculated paralysis of its political leadership. For Ernst Kaltenbrunner, this was not an invasion, it was a completion. 7 years of underground work, of arrests and imprisonments and clandestine border crossings, had been building toward precisely this moment, the absorption of his homeland into the Greater German Reich, the final victory of the movement he had served at significant personal cost. He was 34 years old, and the world was finally catching up to what he had believed all along. The mechanics of the Anschluss, as the annexation was known, required a legal fig leaf, and Kaltenbrunner was positioned to provide one. Acting on orders from Hermann Göring, he had worked in the critical days before the German entry to facilitate the handover of Austrian governmental functions to Nazi-sympathetic figures. He was given the role of State Secretary for Public Security in the Seyss-Inquart cabinet, the transitional government that existed for the brief 3-day window between Schuschnigg's resignation and the formal incorporation of Austria into Germany. It was a ceremonial position, in the sense that the real power was being exercised elsewhere, by larger forces, but it was also a recognition of what Kaltenbrunner represented. He was the man who had maintained the underground structure through its most difficult years, and the title of State Secretary was his reward for that maintenance. The promotion in rank came swiftly. On the 21st of March 1938, Kaltenbrunner was elevated to SS Brigade Führer. By September of the same year, he had been promoted again to SS Gruppenführer, the equivalent of a lieutenant general in the conventional military. He was elected to the Reichstag as a deputy from the newly designated Austrian region, now called Ostmark. He was appointed higher SS and police leader for the Austrian command, which Himmler designated as SS Oberabschnitt Donau, the Danube region. This was the primary SS administrative command in Austria, giving Kaltenbrunner control over the police and security apparatus of an entire country. The man who had operated in shadows for years now had an official desk, an official title, and official authority over a population of millions. The transition from underground organizer to official administrator was not smooth in every respect. There were structural adjustments, jurisdictional negotiations, the ordinary friction of a new bureaucracy being built on the ruins of an old one. But Kaltenbrunner adapted with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his underground years. One of his earliest and most consequential acts as an official Austrian figure was the establishment of the Mauthausen-Gusen concentration camp near Linz. Mauthausen was the first Nazi concentration camp opened on Austrian soil following the Anschluss, a purpose-built facility for political enemies, racial undesirables, and anyone else the new order designated as a threat. Its construction was not incidental to the Kaltenbrunner story. It was a direct expression of his administrative priorities. The infrastructure of repression needed to be built immediately, before any resistance could organize. Mauthausen would go on to become one of the most brutal camps in the entire Nazi system, a place where tens of thousands of people died from forced labor, starvation, disease, and direct killing. Its quarry, where prisoners were worked to exhaustion and beyond, would become one of the defining images of Nazi camp brutality. Kaltenbrunner did not personally design the camp's operations in their later extremity, but he created the structure. He identified the need, secured the location, and set the administrative wheels in motion. In the language of bureaucratic responsibility, Mauthausen was his project, a permanent, physical monument to what he believed should be done with the enemies of his movement, and he would inspect it again, years later, in circumstances that would be directly cited in his Nuremberg indictment. Among the immediate practical matters following the Anschluss was the question of Austria's Jewish population. Vienna was one of the most significant Jewish communities in all of Europe, culturally rich, economically established, and utterly vulnerable to the new order that had just arrived from Berlin. Kaltenbrunner's position as the senior security and police figure in Austria placed him in direct administrative oversight of what happened to that community. One of the instruments he supervised in this period was Adolf Eichmann's Central Office for Jewish Emigration, the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, established in Vienna to manage the forced removal of Jews from Austrian territory. The mechanism worked through a combination of bureaucratic pressure, economic coercion, and the threat of worse. By April 1939, Kaltenbrunner had helped force tens of thousands of Jews to leave Austria. The word used at the time was emigration. What it actually was, the systematic dispossession and expulsion of human beings from their homes, their livelihoods, and their country under threat of violence, was something different. In June 1940, Kaltenbrunner was additionally appointed Vienna's chief of police, adding another layer of security authority to his already substantial portfolio. He spent the early war years consolidating his position, building his intelligence network, and extending his relationships with the key figures of the SS and the party. He was not yet a figure of Reichsnachrichtendienst that remained centered in Berlin, in the person of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA. But Kaltenbrunner was visibly on a trajectory. He was building the kind of regional power base and personal reputation that attracted the attention of the men who made appointments. Himmler was watching. What does the Anschluss period tell us about Kaltenbrunner, beyond the obvious record of escalating rank and expanding authority? It tells us that he was a man who understood how power works in a system, not through dramatic gestures or public speeches, but through institutional control, patient accumulation, and the quiet management of the machinery of coercion. He never gave major public addresses. He rarely appeared in the Reich press. He worked through paper, through networks, through the careful cultivation of relationships with the right people at the right moment. This was not merely a temperament, it was a method, and it was a method that would carry him, in January 1943, to the most consequential appointment of his life, the one that would define him forever, in the worst possible way. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Heydrich. The assassination that changed everything. To understand why Kaltenbrunner became who he became, you must first understand the man he replaced. Reinhard Heydrich was, in the assessment of many who studied the Nazi leadership, the most dangerous individual in the entire Third Reich, including Hitler himself. He was brilliant, cold, physically imposing in a different way from Kaltenbrunner, and possessed of a calculating intelligence that combined administrative genius with a complete absence of moral restraint. Where other senior Nazis were driven by ideology, or personal loyalty, or bureaucratic ambition, Heydrich appeared to be driven by something harder to name, a kind of pure, operational dedication to power itself. He built the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, from a collection of overlapping and competing agencies into a unified, terrifyingly efficient instrument of state control. He was 37 years old and being considered as a possible successor to Hitler when, in late May 1942, he was attacked on a road in Prague by Czechoslovak soldiers parachuted in by the British Special Operations Executive. Heydrich had been serving as acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, effectively the Nazi overlord of what had been Czechoslovakia, and had developed a habit of commuting to his office in an open car without the kind of heavy security escort that his actual position warranted. It was a characteristic gesture of contemptuous self-confidence. He believed himself untouchable, and he drove through the streets of Prague without armored protection as a statement of that belief. The soldiers who attacked his vehicle, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, threw a modified anti-tank grenade as his car slowed on a sharp bend. The detonation wounded Heydrich with fragments, and though he initially appeared to be recovering, septic infection set in. He died on the 4th of June, 1942. The man who had been the architect of much of what would become the Holocaust, who had chaired the Wannsee Conference earlier that year, where the logistics of mass murder were formalized and coordinated, was gone. The Nazis responded to Heydrich's assassination with a fury that demonstrated exactly the kind of power his office had wielded. The village of Lidice, in Bohemia, was identified, on entirely fabricated grounds, as having sheltered the assassins. The entire male population of the village was killed. The women and children were sent to concentration camps. The village itself was burned, bulldozed, and erased from maps. Thousands of Czechs across the Protectorate were executed in the weeks that followed. The terror that Heydrich had built and personified was now being deployed in his name, posthumously, as a demonstration of what the SS considered appropriate grief. It was also a demonstration of institutional power. The Russia did not need Heydrich to function. The machine he had built could sustain and extend itself without him, for a time, under the acting management of Himmler himself. But a permanent replacement was needed. The RSHA was too important, too central to the entire war effort, to the occupation of Europe, to the implementation of the regime's most extreme policies, to remain under acting leadership indefinitely. Himmler considered the available candidates carefully. The obvious choices, in terms of institutional seniority, were Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, and Walter Schellenberg, who ran the SD's foreign intelligence operations. Both were capable and deeply embedded in the system. But Himmler passed over both of them. He passed over the politically sophisticated Wilhelm Stuckart as well. Instead, in January 1943, he reached down into his Austrian command and summoned Ernst Kaltenbrunner to Berlin. The appointment surprised people. Historian Anthony Reid notes that Kaltenbrunner was not the obvious choice by any conventional measure of seniority or inside Berlin political capital. He was known in Austria as a formidable regional operator, but he was a comparative newcomer to the Reich-level stage. Some historians have suggested this was precisely why Himmler chose him. A newcomer would be more pliable, more dependent on Himmler's patronage, less likely to develop the kind of independent power base that Heydrich had built, and that had, paradoxically, made Heydrich something of a threat to Himmler's own position. If that was the calculation, it was one of the more catastrophic miscalculations of the entire Nazi period. Kaltenbrunner proved to be far more than a pliable subordinate. Within months of his appointment, he was bypassing Himmler to report directly to Hitler, a relationship that Kaltenbrunner cultivated with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything else. What exactly was the RSHA that Kaltenbrunner now headed? It is worth pausing to understand the scale and nature of the institution, because without that understanding, the weight of what Kaltenbrunner's appointment meant becomes abstract. The RSHA was the unified command for all of Germany's security and intelligence functions. It contained the Gestapo, the secret state police, responsible for identifying and destroying political opposition within Germany and the occupied territories. It contained the Kripo, the Criminal Investigation Office. It contained the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence arm of the SS, which operated both domestically and abroad. It also controlled the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that had followed the German army into the Soviet Union and had murdered hundreds of thousands of people in the occupied Eastern territories. And it controlled the administrative apparatus of the final solution, the coordinated program for the physical extermination of European Jews. Kaltenbrunner inherited all of this. The new RSHA chief arrived in Berlin in January 1943 to find a machine already in motion. The exterminations at the camps in occupied Poland, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, were underway. The Einsatzgruppen operations in the East had been operating for more than a year. The bureaucratic infrastructure for identifying, registering, rounding up, and transporting Jewish populations across every German-occupied and German-influenced territory in Europe was functioning. Kaltenbrunner did not build this system. He inherited it, but he ran it. He expanded it. He signed the orders that kept it moving, and he did so not reluctantly, as a man cornered by circumstance, but with the conviction of someone who had been building his career toward exactly this kind of institutional authority for more than a decade. Here is the shadow of Heydrich, not the ghost of a man, but the ghost of a system. Heydrich had designed an institution so self-sustaining, so deeply embedded in the bureaucratic and military fabric of the Reich, that it could absorb a leadership transition and continue functioning without interruption. Kaltenbrunner inherited a shadow cast by someone else. His task, in the early months of his tenure, was to step out from beneath it, to establish his own authority, his own methods, and his own relationships with Hitler and the other senior figures of the regime. He would do this, and he would do it effectively, but the path he walked to assert his authority would lead, inexorably, deeper into the operations of mass murder than even Heydrich had taken the office. The shadow would not shrink, it would grow. Chapter 5. The Man at the Top, Running the Machine of Terror. The first weeks of Kaltenbrunner's tenure as chief of the RSHA were, by all institutional accounts, a period of careful positioning. He was new to Berlin, new to the Reich-level political environment, and acutely aware that he was being measured against a predecessor who had been considered the second most powerful man in Germany. He moved quickly on several fronts simultaneously, consolidating his personal relationships with Hitler, asserting authority over the competing baronies within the RSHA, and, most significantly for his own ambitions, working to bring the Abwehr, the Wehrmacht's military intelligence service, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, under RSHA control. This last project was something Heydrich had begun, and Kaltenbrunner would complete. By 1944, the Abwehr had been effectively absorbed into the RSHA, with its remnants restructured as the RSHA's own military intelligence section. Kaltenbrunner had inherited Heydrich's empire and then extended it. One of the most consequential early decisions of Kaltenbrunner's tenure was his immediate tightening of the security grip within Germany itself. He was aware, through the RSHA's own intelligence reporting, that the Allied bombing campaigns were eroding civilian morale, that the Eastern Front was not developing as propaganda had promised, and that the historical memory of the home front collapse at the end of the First World War, the so-called stab in the back, haunted the Nazi leadership. Another collapse from within was their deepest institutional fear. Kaltenbrunner's response was characteristic. More surveillance, more arrests, more executions of those deemed defeatist or disloyal. The Gestapo under his direction became even more aggressive in pursuing ordinary Germans who made private comments about the war, wrote letters expressing doubt, or failed to display sufficient public enthusiasm for the regime. The machinery of internal repression that had always been a feature of the Nazi state was placed into higher gear. The operations of the RSHA under Kaltenbrunner's direction were documented in extraordinary detail at Nuremberg, though establishing personal responsibility for specific orders proved difficult, for reasons that became clear during the trial. Kaltenbrunner's authority to order both the commitment to and release from concentration camps was formally established. Orders to this effect went out over his signature regularly. He also issued orders, or transmitted them from Himmler, for the execution of prisoners in the camps. One specific decree issued during his tenure became particularly important to the Nuremberg prosecution, the Bullet Decree, under which certain escaped prisoners of war who were recaptured were taken directly to Mauthausen and shot, rather than returned to ordinary POW status. This represented a deliberate, formally authorized extension of the killing apparatus to a new category of victims, Allied servicemen, a direct violation of the rules of war that Germany had formally accepted. The summer of 1943 brought Kaltenbrunner back to the place he had helped build before the war, Mauthausen concentration camp, now expanded into the Mauthausen-Gusen complex, one of the most extensive and deadly in the entire Nazi system. He visited the camp, and the visit was documented in evidence introduced at the International Military Tribunal. 15 prisoners were selected by the detention chief to demonstrate for Kaltenbrunner 3 methods of killing: by a gunshot to the back of the neck, by hanging, and by gassing. After the demonstrations, Kaltenbrunner toured the crematorium. He then visited the quarry, the site where prisoners were worked to death under conditions of deliberate brutality. He left without issuing any orders to stop, change, or moderate what he had seen. He had seen exactly what was happening, and he had seen it on a guided tour arranged specifically for his benefit. In October of 1943, Kaltenbrunner sent a message to Herbert Kappler, the senior German police and security figure in Rome, stating that the eradication of the Jews in Italy was of special interest to general security. 4 days later, Kappler's SS and police units began rounding up and deporting Rome's Jewish community. Trains carrying more than 1,000 people departed for Auschwitz. The connection between Kaltenbrunner's communication and the timing of the Rome deportation was not circumstantial. It was the operating mechanism of the RSHA. The center issued the priority, the field units responded with action. Kaltenbrunner was the center. This pattern would repeat itself across the occupied territories and Germany's satellite and allied states for the remaining years of the war. Perhaps the most numerically significant single episode during Kaltenbrunner's tenure as RSHA chief was the deportation of Hungary's Jews in 1944. Hungary had been a German ally throughout the war, and its Jewish population, estimated at 750,000 people, had survived the first years of the conflict with relative, if precarious, safety. In the spring of 1944, Hitler summoned Hungary's regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy, to Klesheim Castle, near Salzburg, where intense pressure was applied to force Hungary into closer integration with Germany's war effort and its racial policies. Kaltenbrunner was present for these negotiations. When Horthy was finally escorted out, Kaltenbrunner accompanied him on part of the journey back to Hungary. Adolf Eichmann traveled in the same convoy, bringing with him a special Einsatzkommando unit, whose purpose was to begin the immediate roundup and deportation of Hungarian Jews. Within weeks, trains were running from Hungary to Auschwitz, in numbers that strained the camp's own administrative capacity. In under 3 months, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported. The majority were killed on arrival. Kaltenbrunner had been in the room where the decision was made. The scale of what the RSHA administered under Kaltenbrunner's direction between January 1943 and the end of the war in May 1945 is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a single coherent fact. The Nuremberg Tribunal judgment, in its findings on Kaltenbrunner, noted that during his tenure as head of the RSHA, the organization was engaged in a widespread program of war crimes and crimes against humanity, a program that included the murder of Soviet prisoners of war, the persecution and execution of civilian populations in occupied territories, the systematic torture and deportation of resistance members, the killing of Allied parachutists under the commando order, and the continued administration of the final solution, under which approximately 6 million Jews were murdered, of whom 2 million were killed by Einsatzgruppen and similar units under RSHA control. Yet Kaltenbrunner himself remained largely invisible to the outside world throughout this period. He gave no major public speeches. His name appeared in public print rarely, if at all. Even within Germany, he was known primarily in professional and official circles. He operated exactly as a security and intelligence chief was supposed to operate. In the background, controlling the machinery, signing the papers, building the relationships that kept the system running. His obscurity was not accidental. It was professional pride, and it would serve him at Nuremberg, at least initially, in his attempts to deny that any of this had anything to do with him. Chapter 6. The July Plot. Hunting. The Conspirators from Within. On the 20th of July 1944, a briefcase containing an explosive device was placed beneath a heavy oak conference table inside a wooden building at Hitler's wartime headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, the Wolfschanze, in the forests of East Prussia. The man who placed it there was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated Wehrmacht officer who had survived severe wounds in North Africa and had come to believe, with a conviction shaped by military catastrophe and moral horror, that Hitler had to be killed if Germany were to survive as a nation. The bomb detonated. 4 people were killed. Hitler survived, protected partly by the heavy table and partly by the fact that the briefcase had been moved by another officer who found it in his way. The survival was not predestined. It was accidental, but it was total. What followed in the hours and days after the blast was a convulsion within the German state that shook every institution and every individual who had ever held a doubt about the regime. Kaltenbrunner was summoned immediately to the Wolf's Lair, by Hitler personally, to take charge of the investigation. This was, in itself, a significant statement of where Kaltenbrunner stood in Hitler's personal hierarchy. The investigation of an attempted assassination of the Führer was not delegated to a subordinate. It was given to the man Hitler trusted most among the security apparatus, a man who had known Hitler since the shared world of their Austrian youth, who had served without wavering, and who could be relied upon to pursue the investigation with maximum ferocity. The investigation that Kaltenbrunner oversaw was comprehensive and brutal. Once it became clear that the bombing had been the detonation point of a broader conspiracy, a planned military coup that had involved officers at the very highest levels of the Wehrmacht command, Himmler and Kaltenbrunner both had to move carefully. The military was not technically under RSHA jurisdiction. The Gestapo's writ ran through the civilian and occupied territories, but the Wehrmacht was a separate constitutional entity. The coup's failure resolved this delicacy quickly. Once the plotters were identified and neutralized, there was no longer a question of institutional jurisdiction. The investigation became a purge. The purge became, in its own way, a second and smaller war, conducted by the RSHA against the Wehrmacht officer class. The numbers that emerged from the aftermath of the 20th of July were staggering in their own right. An estimated 5,000 people were eventually executed in connection with the plot, not all of them proven conspirators, not all of them even directly involved. Many were family members of suspects, or individuals whose names had appeared in the papers and communications of the arrested conspirators, or people who had known the wrong person at the wrong time. The principle was collective punishment. The regime intended the scale of the reprisal to serve as a deterrent against any future attempt. Kaltenbrunner was the instrument through which that principle was operationalized. He called for the executions. He presided over the investigation machinery. He was the man whose office processed the names, the evidence, and the orders. Among the most consequential threads of the investigation was the discovery of the Zossen documents. Hidden in a safe at the former Abwehr headquarters at Zossen, Brandenburg, was an archive that the conspirators had been building since at least 1933. Detailed records of Nazi crimes, coup planning materials, and evidence of complicity by figures at the very top of the regime and military command. The existence of this archive demonstrated something deeply uncomfortable, that knowledge of what the regime was doing had been widespread among people who had publicly supported it, and that opposition to Hitler had existed, in organized form, far longer and far deeper within the military establishment than anyone had publicly acknowledged. On the 22nd of September 1944, Kaltenbrunner's men discovered the documents, and he reported to Martin Bormann that concrete plans to overthrow Hitler had existed as far back as the Blomberg-Fritsch crisis of February 1938. What Kaltenbrunner did with the Zossen documents is illuminating. He personally supervised their transport to Schloss Mittersill in the Tyrol, and then had them burned. The destruction was not random or panicked. It was a considered decision. Some of the documents implicated figures, like Abwehr chief Wilhelm Canaris, who had already been arrested and would face trial. Their destruction might seem to have weakened the prosecution case, but Kaltenbrunner's calculation was almost certainly different. Those documents also contained material that was dangerous to the Russia, to the SS, and potentially to Kaltenbrunner himself. An archive that recorded the full scope of Nazi crimes in the hands of the wrong people was a liability. It was burned not to protect the defendants, but to protect the institution, and by extension, the man who ran it. The 20th of July and its aftermath also revealed something about Kaltenbrunner's relationship with Hitler that distinguished him from the other senior figures of the regime. He was not merely a subordinate who reported to the Führer through official channels. He was, according to CIA intelligence documents compiled from post-war interrogations, someone who had personal ties to Hitler, reaching back to their shared Austrian origins. ties that allowed Kaltenbrunner to bypass Himmler and communicate directly with Hitler when he chose. By the final year of the war, Kaltenbrunner was spending several hours daily with Hitler, a level of personal access that was genuinely remarkable given the paranoia and isolation that characterized Hitler's final period. His subordinate Wilhelm Hotel, in post-war testimony, described Kaltenbrunner's relationship with Hitler as approaching a kind of religious conviction, a belief that Hitler was a man sent by God, a figure who could not be questioned or doubted. By the end of 1944, Kaltenbrunner was at the peak of his power and, simultaneously, in the middle of a collapsing system. Germany was losing the war. Everyone who had access to honest intelligence, and Kaltenbrunner, as RSHA chief, had more honest intelligence than virtually anyone in the Reich, knew it. The Soviet armies were deep into Eastern Europe. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and were advancing toward the Rhine. The Reich was being compressed from every direction. In December 1944, Kaltenbrunner was granted the additional rank of General of the Waffen-SS. In November of that year, he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the War, Merit Cross with Swords. The Reich was distributing honors to its servants while burning at the edges. And Kaltenbrunner, the underground man from Linz, the lawyer who had become the most powerful security official in a state built on terror, was preparing, in his own careful way, for what came next. The war was ending. The question was not whether, the question was what came after. Chapter 7. The Final Solution. Kaltenbrunner's direct hand, _. There is a particular kind of historical responsibility that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a declaration or a ceremony. It is built, document by document, signature by signature, order by order, in the ordinary administrative rhythm of an office. Paper in, paper out, stamp applied, file closed. Ernst Kaltenbrunner's connection to the systematic murder of European Jews was not the responsibility of a man who personally designed the program or who sat at a table and proposed it. It was something in some ways more difficult to understand and more important to understand precisely. It was the responsibility of the man who received the machine fully assembled and chose, every single day, to keep it running, to run it harder, to protect it from interruption, and to extend it into every remaining corner of the continent that the Reich still controlled. That choice, made daily, consciously, by a qualified lawyer who understood exactly what he was authorizing, is what places Kaltenbrunner among the most significant individual perpetrators of the Holocaust. The administrative structure through which the final solution operated was, by the time Kaltenbrunner arrived at the RSHA in January 1943, already a functioning bureaucratic organism. The Wannsee Conference, chaired by Heydrich in January 1942, had formalized the coordination mechanisms between the RSHA and the various Reich ministries and occupied territory authorities. The death camps in occupied Poland were operational. The Einsatzgruppen had already carried out mass shootings across the eastern occupied territories on a scale that had no precedent in modern history. The railway deportation system, which used the ordinary infrastructure of the national rail network to move millions of people to their deaths, was embedded in the logistical fabric of the German wartime economy. Kaltenbrunner did not build any of this. What he built, in the 28 months between his appointment and Germany's defeat, was the continuation, the expansion, and the administrative insulation of the system from any outside interference that might have slowed or stopped it. The relationship between Kaltenbrunner and Adolf Eichmann is central to understanding how this worked in practice. Eichmann, as head of RSHA subsection 4B4, was the operational manager of the deportation program, the man who negotiated with railway authorities, coordinated with local police and SS commands in occupied territories, and tracked the numbers of people moved from each country or region toward the killing centers. Eichmann and Kaltenbrunner knew each other from the streets of Linz. They shared a history that predated the Reich. But the professional relationship between them during the war was not one of old friends working together easily. It was a relationship of superior and subordinate, formal and instrumentalized, in which Kaltenbrunner provided the institutional cover and the top-level authority, and Eichmann provided the logistical execution. Kaltenbrunner needed Eichmann's competence. Eichmann needed Kaltenbrunner's authority. The machine needed both of them. One of the most documented examples of Kaltenbrunner's direct intervention in Holocaust operations was his active lobbying against the wishes of elements within the Reich's own foreign ministry for the deportation of Jewish populations from countries that were nominally neutral or diplomatically sensitive. In the case of Hungary, which has been addressed, his presence at the Klesheim negotiations and his coordination with Eichmann's Sonderkommando unit was documented in post-war testimony. But Hungary was not the only theatre. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, Kaltenbrunner's office sent directives to German plenipotentiaries and police attachés across occupied Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, in Greece, in the Balkans, pressing for the acceleration of deportation schedules and the removal of exemptions that local administrators had been granting to certain categories of Jews on economic or diplomatic grounds. He wanted no exemptions. He worked systematically to close every gap in the program through which a person might slip. The resistance he encountered from within the Reich's own administrative structure is historically important and often overlooked. There were German officials in the foreign ministry, in certain military commands, in some of the satellite states, who dragged their feet, invented bureaucratic delays, or quietly extended protections to Jewish populations under their authority. Some did this out of genuine moral scruple. Others did it because they were calculating the end of the war and wanted a record of having been something other than fully complicit. Kaltenbrunner identified these pockets of resistance and addressed them directly, through pressure on the individuals concerned, through threats, through the replacement of insufficiently zealous local officials with more reliable ones, and through the escalation of RSHA authority over decisions that had previously rested with the civilian administration. The final solution, under his direction, was not permitted to lose momentum. It was the one operation that he treated as genuinely non-negotiable. There is also the matter of what the RSHA knew, and when it knew it. By the later stages of the war, the intelligence reports flowing into Kaltenbrunner's office from across the continent were not merely security assessments or political analyses. They included regular updates on the operational status of the killing centers, the processing capacity of individual camps, the numbers of transports arriving, and the pace at which they were being handled. Kaltenbrunner was an intelligence professional. He read his reports. He understood what the numbers meant. He understood that what was being described in the neutral administrative language of his office's internal communications was the organized killing of human beings on an industrial scale. He understood this, not because he accidentally stumbled across the information, but because he was the man at the apex of the system that generated the information. His knowledge was not incidental, it was structural. The camps themselves, Auschwitz in particular, were also subjects of direct RSHA communication during Kaltenbrunner's tenure. The question of technical capacity, how many people the facilities could process, what modifications were required to increase throughput, what supply chains needed to be managed to maintain operations, were the subjects of regular correspondence between RSHA offices in Berlin and the camp administrations. Kaltenbrunner did not design Auschwitz's crematoria or specify the chemical compounds used in the gas chambers, but the administrative authority for the camp system ran through his office. Requests from camp commanders for resources, permission to modify procedures, or guidance on policy questions came up through the SS chain of command to the RSHA. Kaltenbrunner was at the top of that chain. Late in 1944, as the Soviet armies advanced westward and the threat to the eastern camps became a military reality, the question arose of what to do with the surviving prisoners. Heinrich Himmler, in a private decision that he did not publicly announce, had decided to halt the gassings at Auschwitz in the autumn of 1944, a decision driven partly by the approaching Soviet army, partly by diplomatic communications about the possibility of negotiating with the Western Allies through neutral intermediaries. Kaltenbrunner's position on this decision was in direct opposition to Himmler's. The evidence from post-war testimony suggests that Kaltenbrunner pressed for the continuation of the killing operations as long as possible, resisting the impulse that Himmler was feeling toward the end of the war to use surviving Jewish prisoners as a bargaining chip. The friction between Kaltenbrunner and Himmler on this question was one of the first open cracks in a relationship that had always been one of disciplined subordination. The death marches of the final months of the war, the forced movement of concentration camp prisoners across the collapsing Reich in winter without adequate food, shelter, or clothing, were the last operational phase of the system Kaltenbrunner oversaw. Tens of thousands of people died on these marches, killed by exhaustion, exposure, starvation, and direct shooting by their guards. The marches were not a bureaucratic accident or an unanticipated side effect of chaotic conditions. They were an administered program. Orders went out about the movement of prisoners, about what should happen to those who could not keep pace, about what the acceptable outcomes were. Those orders, or the authority for those orders, ran through the RSHA. In the final months of the Reich's existence, Kaltenbrunner was still running the machinery of murder, right up to the moment the machinery had no more territory left to operate in. And yet, and this must be stated clearly, because it is historically significant, Kaltenbrunner, at Nuremberg, denied all of it. He denied having issued the orders. He denied knowledge of the specific operations. He denied responsibility for what his subordinates had done. He positioned himself as an intelligence and security official who had limited knowledge of the administrative details of the camp system and who had certainly not issued the personal orders that the prosecution attributed to him. He did this under oath, in front of judges who had the documentary record. The contrast between what the documents showed and what Kaltenbrunner claimed to know defined the Nuremberg proceedings against him more than any other single element. He was a man who had run one of history's most thoroughly documented bureaucracies, and he sat in the dock, insisting he had been, in effect, a passive observer. No one believed him. The documents spoke for themselves. Underscore. Chapter 8. The Intelligence War. Espionage, Deception, and Sirdi. ESD. Underscore. History tends to remember the RSHA, for one thing, its role in the Holocaust and the apparatus of terror inside occupied Europe, and that memory is correct and necessary. But the RSHA was also a functioning intelligence service, and one of the most significant in the Second World War, not because of its successes, which were real, but because of the extraordinary breadth of its ambitions and the often remarkable sophistication of its actual operations. Under Kaltenbrunner, the intelligence dimension of the RSHA was not secondary to the security and policing functions. He was genuinely interested in intelligence work, perhaps more interested in it than in any other aspect of his role. If there was a domain where Kaltenbrunner brought something that went beyond mere institutional maintenance, it was in the development of the RSHA's intelligence capabilities in the final years of the war. Walter Schellenberg headed the SD's Foreign Intelligence Section, the Ostland SD, or Section 6 of the RSA. He was a different kind of intelligence professional from Kaltenbrunner, younger, more urbane, more comfortable in the world of diplomatic intrigue and double-agent management. Schellenberg had been building a foreign intelligence network throughout the war, with varying degrees of effectiveness, and he had cultivated a personal relationship with Himmler that gave him significant independence of operation. His relationship with Kaltenbrunner was, from the beginning, uneasy. Schellenberg found Kaltenbrunner coarse and parochial. Kaltenbrunner found Schellenberg politically unreliable, and not without cause, since Schellenberg was already, by the end of the war, contemplating the construction of a post-war life that required demonstrating distance from the regime's worst crimes. Their rivalry was professional, personal, and ultimately a contest over which of them would define the legacy of the Russia's intelligence work. One of the most significant intelligence coups of the Russia, under Kaltenbrunner's direction, was Operation Zeppelin, the program for recruiting Soviet prisoners of war and anti-Soviet partisans as agents to be deployed behind Red Army lines. The operation had been running since the early years of the Eastern Front campaign, but Kaltenbrunner expanded and refined it during his tenure. Agents were recruited from prisoner of war camps, trained at special RSHA facilities, and then airdropped or infiltrated into Soviet-controlled territory with sabotage and intelligence-gathering missions. Many were captured immediately. Many others were doubled by Soviet intelligence and fed disinformation back to Berlin. But some operations produced genuine intelligence value, and the program demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how human intelligence networks could be built and exploited, even in the most hostile environments. The absorption of the Abwehr into the RSHA was the most structurally significant intelligence development of the mid-war period, and it came directly from Kaltenbrunner's persistent pressure on Himmler and Hitler to consolidate German intelligence under a single command. Admiral Canaris had run the Abwehr since 1935, a man of genuine intelligence, tradecraft, and genuine ambiguity, whose organization had, it later became clear, been sheltering some of the most important members of the anti-Hitler resistance. When the Abwehr's connection to the Stauffenberg plot became apparent in the investigation following the 20th of July, the case for its dissolution was made for Kaltenbrunner. By the summer of 1944, the Abwehr's viable remnants had been reorganized under RSHA authority as the Militarisches Amt. Kaltenbrunner now controlled all of Germany's significant intelligence functions, foreign and domestic, military and civilian. It was an unprecedented consolidation of intelligence authority, and it was almost entirely his achievement. The role of the SD's domestic intelligence function, its inland SD, under Kaltenbrunner, deserves particular attention because it reveals something important about how the regime understood its own population. The domestic SD produced regular, detailed reports, the SD Meldungen, on the actual state of public opinion inside Germany and the occupied territories. These were not propaganda documents. They were honest assessments of what people were thinking, saying, and believing, compiled from networks of informers and observers across the country, and intended to give the regime accurate information about civilian morale. By the middle period of the war, the SD Meldungen were reporting deteriorating civilian morale, widespread war weariness, private doubts about the leadership's competence, and a growing conviction that Germany was losing. Kaltenbrunner received these reports and forwarded them, sometimes directly, to Hitler. Whether Hitler acted on them honestly, or whether they simply confirmed his conviction that the German people needed to be pushed harder toward total commitment, is a question the historical record does not fully resolve. The foreign intelligence operations of the RSHA in the final years of the war ranged from the genuinely effective to the catastrophically mismanaged. One notable success was the penetration of the British Special Operations Executive's Dutch network, a counterintelligence operation known as the England Spiel, or England Game, which the Abwehr had begun and the SD continued. Over a period of years, German intelligence had captured British agents and Dutch resistance members, then used their radio equipment and codes to feed false information back to London while routing incoming agents directly into German custody. More than 50 Allied agents were captured, and the operation produced significant intelligence value, though the post-war accounting of this operation raises deeply uncomfortable questions about British intelligence failures that were never fully acknowledged. Kaltenbrunner inherited this operation already running and benefited from its continued product. The counterpart to this success was the complete failure of German intelligence to anticipate or adequately respond to the Allied invasion of occupied France in June 1944. The RSHA, along with all other German intelligence services, was comprehensively deceived by Operation Bodyguard, the Allied deception program that convinced the German High Command that the main Allied landing would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Kaltenbrunner's SD reports contributed to the false picture by faithfully relaying agent intelligence that was itself being fed by Allied-controlled double agents. The German intelligence failure at Normandy was not simply a failure of analysis or collection, it was a failure of the fundamental architecture of the intelligence system, which had been systematically compromised without its operators knowing. The best-run intelligence service in the world can be defeated if its agents are working for the other side. And in Western Europe, by mid-1944, that was exactly the situation Kaltenbrunner's organization faced. There was also a particular operation in late 1944 that illustrated both the ingenuity and the desperation of German intelligence in the final phase of the war. Operation Bernhard, actually a continuation of a program begun before Kaltenbrunner's tenure, involved the production of forged British currency at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, using prisoner labor to manufacture near-perfect copies of British 5, 10, 20, and 50-pound notes. The intention was to flood the British economy with counterfeit currency and destabilize the pound sterling. Tens of millions of pounds worth of forgeries were produced. The distribution plan never fully materialized, but the technical achievement, genuine master craftsmen among the prisoner workforce, producing currency that fooled banks across neutral Europe, was remarkable in its own disturbing way. Many of the forged notes ended up as payment to German agents and contacts across neutral countries in the final months of the war, and some surfaced in circulation years after the war ended. As the war's end approached, Kaltenbrunner became intensely occupied with two intelligence concerns that dominated his final months in office. The first was the question of Allied intentions regarding German war crimes, whether the Allies genuinely intended to prosecute Nazi leaders after the war, and if so, on what evidence and through what legal mechanism. The Russia's reporting on Allied political intentions in this period was extensive and, largely, accurate. The Allies did intend to prosecute, and they were assembling the documentary record to do so. This intelligence contributed to the frantic document destruction operations of the final weeks of the war, including the burning of Russia files across multiple locations. The second concern was the possibility of negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies through neutral channels that would allow Germany to turn its full military attention to the Soviet Union. Schellenberg was involved in these approaches through Swedish and Swiss intermediaries. Kaltenbrunner regarded these efforts with deep suspicion, partly because he genuinely believed in continued resistance, and partly because he was aware that Himmler was promoting them, and he had come to distrust Himmler's judgment in the final months of the Reich. The intelligence dimensions of Kaltenbrunner's tenure ultimately reinforced the same conclusion that every other dimension of his career points toward. He was an exceptionally capable institutional operator, a man of genuine professional competence, who applied those capabilities fully and without reservation in the service of a state committed to mass murder. His intelligence work was not separate from his security work. They were two functions of the same machine, operated by the same hands, for the same ultimate purpose. And when the machine finally stopped, When the Reich it had served collapsed around him, Kaltenbrunner went not to a bunker, but to a mountain, carrying what he believed he might need to survive what came next. Chapter 9. Himmler's Shadow. A relationship built on ambition and friction. And for you, every powerful man in the Third Reich operated within a web of relationships that were simultaneously collegial and competitive, professionally dependent and personally suspicious. The Nazi state was not a conventional hierarchy, with clear lines of command and reliable institutional loyalty. It was, by deliberate design, a system of competing power centers, overlapping jurisdictions, rival agencies, personal loyalties, running directly to Hitler over the heads of institutional chains, that Hitler himself had engineered to prevent any single figure from accumulating enough independent power to threaten his position. Within that system, the relationship between Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Heinrich Himmler was one of the most important and least examined partnerships of the entire regime. It was a relationship built on mutual need, mutual use, and, as the war deteriorated, mounting mutual suspicion. Himmler had been the architect of the entire SS empire. He had built it from a small personal bodyguard unit in the late 1920s into the most powerful organization in the Reich, controlling the concentration camps, the Waffen-SS military formations, the police apparatus, the intelligence services, and the economic enterprises that made the SS financially semi-autonomous from the state budget. He was, in the formal organizational chart, Kaltenbrunner's superior. Kaltenbrunner reported to Himmler. Himmler reported to Hitler. This was the official structure. And in the early years of Kaltenbrunner's tenure as RSHA chief, the relationship worked largely within this structure. Kaltenbrunner ran the RSHA's operations with considerable independence, but major policy questions were cleared with Himmler, and Kaltenbrunner did not attempt to operate in Himmler's domains without permission. The dynamic began to shift in the aftermath of the 20th of July 1944. Himmler's response to the assassination plot had been, in the immediate term, effective. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Reserve Army, giving him formal military authority that he had never previously held. But the July plot had also shaken Himmler in ways that were not immediately visible. It had demonstrated that resistance to Hitler existed at the highest levels of the military, a fact that Himmler, as the man nominally responsible for internal security, had failed to detect and prevent. Hitler's private confidence in Himmler, though never openly expressed as a rebuke, was visibly diminished. Kaltenbrunner, as the man who had actually run the investigation into the plot and had delivered its results directly to Hitler, emerged from the crisis with an enhanced personal standing at the Führer's court. He had not replaced Himmler, but he had established a direct channel to Hitler that bypassed Himmler entirely, and he used it. Himmler's deepening personal crisis in the final year of the war is one of the more psychologically complex stories in the entire history of the Reich. By late 1944, Himmler, the man who had built the apparatus of mass murder and run it for more than a decade, had begun to believe that he might have a future after Hitler, and that this future required demonstrating to the Western Allies that he was a man they could do business with. He was in contact through neutral intermediaries, including Swedish Red Cross official Count Folke Bernadotte, about the possibility of negotiating the release of concentration camp prisoners as a gesture of good faith. He was simultaneously promoting Schellenberg's peace-feeler operations, and he had begun, quietly, to discuss with inner circle figures the possibility of Hitler's incapacity, a line of thought that, in the paranoid atmosphere of the final Reich, was practically treasonous. Kaltenbrunner knew about much of this, through his own intelligence channels. His response was complicated by his personal convictions and his institutional loyalties. He genuinely believed, or had convinced himself, that Germany could still achieve a negotiated outcome through continued resistance, not through surrender, but through making the cost of final defeat high enough that the Western Allies might separate from the Soviet Union and offer terms. This was a fantasy that the military situation did not support, but it was a fantasy that suited both his ideology and his personal position. If Germany fought on, Kaltenbrunner remained valuable and necessary. If Germany sued for peace through Himmler's channels, Kaltenbrunner, who had worked to continue the Holocaust as late as humanly possible, and who had no credentials as a moderate or a pragmatist, had nothing to offer the Allies and everything to fear from them. His interest in continued resistance was not separable from his interest in self-preservation. The open break between Kaltenbrunner and Himmler came in April 1945, in the final weeks of the Reich's existence. Hitler, by this point confined to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, received intelligence, from Kaltenbrunner's sources, that Himmler was engaged in direct unauthorized negotiations with the Western Allies through Count Bernadotte. The intelligence was accurate. Himmler had met with Bernadotte in Sweden and had made explicit overtures for a separate peace. When Hitler received this information, his reaction was one of total, consuming fury. He immediately stripped Himmler of all his offices: Reichsführer of the SS, Chief of the German Police, Commander of the Reserve Army, every title and function Himmler had accumulated over 2 decades of loyal service, and ordered his arrest. The man who had built the SS empire was declared a traitor in the bunker's final days. Kaltenbrunner had, whether by deliberate action or through the ordinary functioning of the intelligence reporting chain, delivered the information that destroyed Himmler. Was it deliberate? This question has occupied historians for decades, and the honest answer is that the evidence is insufficient for a definitive conclusion. What can be said is that Kaltenbrunner had both the information and the access to deliver it to Hitler, and that he did so at a moment when doing so served his own interest. His positioning as the last reliable senior security figure of the collapsing Reich. Whether the delivery was a calculated act of betrayal or simply a routine intelligence report that happened to have catastrophic consequences for Himmler, depends on how one reads the character of a man who had never previously shown reluctance to use institutional processes for personal advancement. Kaltenbrunner's biographer, Peter Black, stops short of asserting deliberate betrayal, but notes that Kaltenbrunner was certainly aware of what the information would do. The relationship between the two men illuminates something important about how personal relationships function within authoritarian systems. Himmler had chosen Kaltenbrunner, trained him, given him his platform, and protected him during the underground years. He had been, in a real institutional sense, the patron who made Kaltenbrunner's rise possible. And yet the system that Himmler had helped build, a system of total surveillance, of competing loyalties all ultimately directed toward Hitler rather than toward any individual, had no mechanism for protecting personal loyalty from institutional logic. When Himmler became a liability, when his secret negotiations made him a threat to the regime, the system, Kaltenbrunner's system, processed him exactly as it processed every other threat. Loyalty was a language the RSHA spoke fluently, but it was a language that could only ever be conditional. By the last week of April 1945, as Soviet artillery was audible from Berlin's streets, and Hitler was writing his final political testament in the bunker, Kaltenbrunner was no longer in the capital. He had moved his operational base westward, to Austria, to the mountain region around Altausee in the Salzkammergut, the same beautiful alpine territory where the regime had stored priceless cultural treasures looted from across occupied Europe. He was organizing what resistance he could, maintaining communications with the remaining German forces in the area, and apparently still believing, or performing belief, that the Reich could be sustained in some reduced form in the Austrian Alpine redoubt. The reality was different. The regime he had served was dead. Hitler himself would be dead within days. And for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, The most consequential phase of his life, the accounting, was about to begin. Chapter 10. The Burning of Evidence. Last Days of the Reich. Underscore. There is a particular madness to the final weeks of a collapsing totalitarian system that no peacetime experience quite prepares you to understand. The institutions that have organized every aspect of public and private life for years, the offices, the uniform hierarchies, the filing systems and telephone exchanges and command structures, continue to function even as the physical and political reality they were built to serve dissolves around them. Orders are still issued, reports are still compiled and transmitted, paperwork still moves through the correct channels, and simultaneously, the people within those institutions are destroying the very records that document what those institutions did, burning files, shredding documents, dismantling the paper archive of 12 years of Reich administration, in the full knowledge that within days or weeks, the people issuing those destruction orders will themselves be subject to the justice of the victors. The spring of 1945, inside the Russia's exactly this. An institution destroying its own memory in real time while still performing its official functions. Kaltenbrunner had been aware of the danger posed by the Russia's own records since at least the autumn of 1944. The intelligence assessments flowing into his office from neutral countries and from captured Allied documents made it abundantly clear that the Allies intended to prosecute Nazi war criminals and that they were actively assembling a documentary record to support those prosecutions. The RSHA's own files, the orders, the reports, the cables between Berlin and the field commands, the operational records of the Einsatzgruppen, the administrative documentation of the camp system, constituted precisely the kind of primary source material that a prosecution would need. Kaltenbrunner's response was a systematic effort to identify and destroy the most incriminating files before they could be captured. This effort began months before the war ended and continued until the very last days of organized German administration. The destruction was not complete. This is the critical historical fact that the burning campaigns and the shredding operations could not alter. Too much had been produced. Too many copies existed in too many places. The RSHA had operated through a network of regional and sub-regional offices across the entire Reich and all occupied territories, and the documents produced at each level had been distributed upward, downward, and laterally through the bureaucracy. When Allied forces entered German administrative buildings in the spring and summer of 1945, they found filing cabinets that had not been emptied in time, archives that had been marked for destruction but never reached, and caches of documents that had been hidden, sometimes by people who were already thinking about their own post-war circumstances and wanted records that might either implicate others or demonstrate their own lack of final authority. The Nuremberg Tribunal was built on this survival. At Kaltenbrunner's direction, specific categories of document were prioritized for destruction. The records most urgently targeted were those that established direct personal connections between senior RSHA officials, including Kaltenbrunner himself, and specific killing operations, execution orders that bore his signature, communications that established his knowledge of specific camp operations, reports from the Einsatzgruppen that demonstrated the geographic and chronological scope of mass shootings in the East, the Gestapo's prisoner dossiers, which contained not only evidence of the prisoners' crimes, but also the names of the informers and officials who had built the cases against them. Much of this was burned at RSHA headquarters in Berlin. As the Soviet encirclement of the city tightened, other files were transported westward and burned at relay points along the retreat routes. The RSHA staff's westward movement in the final weeks of the war was itself a kind of institutional death rattle. A column of officials, clerks, drivers, and security personnel moving through a disintegrating Reich, carrying what they could, burning what they could not carry, looking for a place where the machinery of state authority might somehow still function. Kaltenbrunner left Berlin in early April 1945, moving through Bavaria and into Austria. He established a temporary command post in the Aussee region, a mountainous, defensible area of the Austrian Salzkammergut that some in the regime still believed could serve as a final stronghold, the so-called Alpine Fortress. The Alpine Fortress concept was a fantasy, a piece of Hitler's strategic thinking in the final months that had no military substance behind it. There were no prepared defensive positions, no stockpiled supplies, in quantities sufficient for a sustained defense, no coherent military plan. But for men like Kaltenbrunner, whose alternative was surrendering to Allied forces with a post-war accounting awaiting them, the fantasy was preferable to the reality. In those final days, Kaltenbrunner was issuing orders that demonstrated the absolute continuity of the Russia's character right to the end. Even as Berlin burned and the Soviet and Western Allied armies converged on the Reich from every direction, RSHA operational directives continued to authorize the killing of prisoners. The death marches continued. Executions of political prisoners, whose continued existence was deemed a security risk, were authorized. In one particularly documented case, the killing of hundreds of inmates at Mauthausen, the camp Kaltenbrunner had helped found and had visited to observe its methods, continued through late April and into early May of 1945. The machinery did not stop because the war was ending. It stopped because there was physically no more territory in which it could operate. There was also, in these final days, the extraordinary matter of the salt mines at Alto See. The Nazi regime had accumulated one of the largest collections of stolen and looted art in history. Masterworks removed from galleries, private collections, churches, and cultural institutions across every occupied country. Much of this collection had been moved as the Allied bombing campaigns intensified into underground storage in the salt mines near Alto See, a naturally stable, climate-controlled environment in the Austrian mountains that was considered safe from both bombing and conventional military attack. Among the Altaussee collection were works by Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and hundreds of other masters, cultural property whose loss would have been, by any measure, irreparable. In the final weeks, a fanatical SS officer ordered that explosive mines be placed throughout the tunnels to destroy the collection rather than allow it to fall into Allied hands. Local Austrian salt miners, assisted by some German officials who had more regard for civilizational heritage than for SS fanaticism, removed the explosives. The collection survived. Kaltenbrunner was present in the region during this episode, though his precise role in the explosive placement or removal is not clearly established in the historical record, and smart reconstruction of his likely position suggests his focus was entirely on his own survival rather than on the cultural question. Hitler died in the Berlin bunker on the 30th of April 1945. The news reached Kaltenbrunner in his Austrian mountain retreat. The regime he had served for 20 years, the movement he had joined as a young lawyer in the reign of Linz's streets, the apparatus he had run at its most powerful and most terrible. All of it was now formally over, pending the formal surrender that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, named in Hitler's testament as successor, was already arranging. Kaltenbrunner did not surrender. He did not turn himself in. He had been the most powerful security official in the Reich, the man who had run the Gestapo and the SD, and had administered the machinery of the Holocaust for more than 2 years. He changed clothes, acquired false identification, and went into hiding in a mountainside hunting lodge above the village of Altaussee. A man who had operated in the shadows since his earliest SS years was retreating to the shadows one final time. His hiding place was a wooden cabin at high altitude, reached by a track that was difficult to navigate without local knowledge. He was in the company of a small number of associates. He had documents in the name of a Dr. Ernst Auerbach. He had what he needed, or believed he had what he needed, to stay hidden long enough for the immediate chaos of the German collapse to resolve into something more predictable, a moment when he might be able to assess his options clearly. He had operated in underground conditions before, under worse pressures, and had survived. He was 41 years old, physically strong, and in his own estimation, probably convinced that the qualities that had sustained him through the Austrian underground years could sustain him again. He did not understand, or could not accept, that the world he had helped destroy had been comprehensively documented, and that the men looking for him were not Austrian gendarmerie running on limited information and political hesitation. They were American intelligence professionals with specific orders, specific resources, and a very specific name on their list. Chapter 11. Captured. The Hunt. In the Austrian Mountains. The Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army was, by the spring of 1945, one of the most effective military intelligence organizations in the world. It had been built from modest beginnings in the early years of the American war effort into a sprawling network of field detachments embedded at every level of the Allied command, trained agents, many of them German-speaking refugees and émigrés, who had fled Europe before the war and now returned to it in American uniforms, conducting interrogations, identifying collaborators, hunting war criminals, and assembling the documentary record that would underpin the post-war prosecutions. The 80th Counterintelligence Corps Detachment, the unit that would locate and capture Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was operating out of the American zone in Austria in the first weeks of May 1945, with a target list that placed the former RSHA chief near the very top. The capture of senior Nazi officials in the first weeks after the German surrender was a race against both time and geography. The Bavarian and Austrian Alps, the territory through which the last remnants of German command authority had retreated, were a vast area of mountains, forest, small villages, and isolated farms where a determined man with local contacts and false papers could remain hidden for months or even years. Some did. Others were found quickly because the networks of informers and the habits of the bureaucratic system they had served provided too many leads to follow and too little cover to sustain. Kaltenbrunner's hiding place, above Altaussee, was not as secure as he believed. The CIC had been receiving information from multiple sources about his probable location, not only from Allied intelligence assets, but from within the German system itself, from individuals who were already calculating the personal advantages of cooperation with the occupation authorities. Kaltenbrunner had made at least one attempt to construct a plausible legend for himself. The identity documents in the name of Ernst Auerbach were intended to establish him as an ordinary civilian, a doctor, the papers suggested, with no connection to the SS or the RSHA. Whether he genuinely believed this legend could hold for any extended period, given that he was one of the most wanted men on the Allied target list, and that his physical appearance, his exceptional height, his distinctive facial scarring, the very specific silhouette of a man who had been photographed, described, and documented in thousands of captured German administrative records, made concealment genuinely difficult, is unclear. What the CIA's historical account of his final days describes is a man who had settled into a kind of waiting, aware that the end was probably coming, but unwilling to make the final decision to surrender voluntarily and face what that meant. On the 13th of May 1945, approximately 2 weeks after Hitler's death and 1 week after the formal German surrender, a patrol from the 80th CIC detachment reached the mountain cabin above Altaussee, where Kaltenbrunner had been sheltering. The circumstances of the final approach and the arrest were documented in the CIC's own after-action reports. Kaltenbrunner was found in the company of two women, his mistress Gisela von Westarp and a companion, at the remote cabin. When confronted by the American agents, he initially maintained the false identity, presenting the Auerbach documents. The agents were not persuaded. One of the women present, in circumstances that the historical record describes with some ambiguity, reportedly identified him when the agents pressed for verification. The physical description matched, the voice matched. The hands of the man standing before them matched the hands of the man in the documentation they carried. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was placed under arrest. The man who had run the Gestapo was now in handcuffs. He was transported initially to 7th Army Headquarters for preliminary processing, and then transferred to the interrogation facilities being established in preparation for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The American interrogators who first questioned him in the days following his capture noted several things that became consistent themes in his subsequent behavior at the trial. He was physically imposing even in custody, maintaining a kind of deliberate personal dignity that was not quite defiance, but was not cooperation either. He denied everything that could be denied. He minimized everything that could be minimized. And he repeatedly described his role as that of a man who had overseen an intelligence operation, who had collected and analyzed information, rather than as the administrator of a security and killing apparatus. The performance had clearly been prepared, mentally at least, long before the arrest. He had been thinking about what he would say if caught, and he had settled on a story that, while entirely inconsistent with the documentary record, was at least internally coherent. The physical examination of Kaltenbrunner at the time of his processing provided the Allied medical and intelligence personnel with a portrait of a man who had aged significantly during the final war years. He was 41 years old, but appeared older. The stress of the final years, the constant movement, the collapse of the Reich he had served, had marked him visibly. He was also, at some point in this period, suffering from a brain hemorrhage that would require surgery and would be used, briefly, as a reason to delay his participation in the early stages of the Nuremberg proceedings. His lawyers would later attempt to use his medical condition as a reason to have him removed from the trial entirely. The tribunal was not sympathetic. The documentary record of what he had authorized was extensive enough that his personal presence in the courtroom was necessary as a matter of both legal procedure and historical accountability. The atmosphere in the weeks immediately following his capture is described in the CIA's historical account of Kaltenbrunner's last days, with a kind of restrained documentary precision that makes it all the more striking. He was moved through a system of Allied detention facilities, interacting with other captured senior Nazis who were also being processed for prosecution. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, the assembled remnants of a leadership whose decisions had killed tens of millions of people. The dynamics of this group, the mutual suspicions, the competition over who would give up whom, the bizarre social hierarchies that reformed even in Allied custody, have been extensively documented in historical accounts. Kaltenbrunner, by all accounts, was not a figure of social prominence even within this group. He was not the former Reichsmarschall or the former foreign minister. He was a man of institutional authority that had been entirely invisible to the public, a security apparatus chief who had operated in darkness and whose name, even among the other prisoners, carried a weight that was felt rather than spoken. He had been, from his first days in the SS underground to his final days as the most powerful security official in the Reich, a man who operated through systems rather than through public presence. He had built networks, accumulated institutional authority, signed orders, and administered machines. He had not given speeches at Nuremberg rallies, or made radio broadcasts, or published manifestos. He had done his work in offices, on paper, through the quiet accumulation of bureaucratic control over the instruments of state violence. And now, in Allied custody, he continued in the same mode, controlled, calculating, presenting the minimum version of himself, giving away as little as possible, waiting to see what the process would require of him before deciding how much further to yield. The man who had administered the most thoroughly documented bureaucratic killing apparatus in history was now calculating how to make that documentation disappear, not physically, since it was already in Allied hands, but rhetorically, through the careful construction of a narrative in which he had been a manager, not an architect, an administrator, not an author. It would not work, but he would try. Underscore. Chapter 12. The Nuremberg Dock. Facing the weight of the record. Glowens. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was the most ambitious judicial undertaking in human history up to that point. 4 Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had agreed to establish a court in the German city of Nuremberg that would try the surviving senior leadership of the Nazi regime on charges that included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The choice of Nuremberg was not accidental. It was the city where the annual Nazi Party rallies had been held, the city whose name was attached to the racial laws of 1935 that had stripped Jews of their citizenship. Trying the Nazi leadership in Nuremberg was a statement about accountability, about the relationship between the ideology those rallies had celebrated and the crimes the trial would document. The proceedings opened on the 20th of November, 1945, and would run until the 1st of October, 1946. Among the 24 defendants in the dock, the surviving senior figures of the Nazi state, Ernst Kaltenbrunner occupied a position that was in some ways paradoxical. He was, by the institutional measure of what he had actually administered, one of the most consequential figures on trial. The RSHA he had headed was directly responsible for more deaths than the organizations controlled by most of his co-defendants. And yet he was not, by public recognition or historical reputation, one of the famous names. He was not Göring, whose Luftwaffe and economic empire had been visible to the world for years. He was not Ribbentrop, whose name had been attached to diplomatic events. He was not Hess, who had flown to Scotland. He was not Speer, whose public profile as the technician of war production had given him a kind of complicated celebrity. Kaltenbrunner was the man in the dock who most of the outside world had to learn about for the first time. His initial absence from proceedings, due to the brain hemorrhage and the surgery that followed, meant that the trial had been underway for some time before he was able to participate. When he finally took his place in the dock, his physical presence was striking, even by the standards of the group assembled there. He was easily the tallest man in the room. The scarred face, the imposing frame, the deliberately controlled demeanor, all of it contributed to a physical impression that was, for the journalists and public observers in the gallery, a kind of confirmation of the worst that had been written about him. He did not look like a bureaucrat. He looked like what the prosecution said he was, a man who had wielded enormous personal authority in the service of organized mass murder. Whether that impression was fair to the institutional complexity of his role, or whether it was simply a physical prejudice that the prosecution was happy to allow to work in their favor, is an interesting historical question. The answer is probably both. The prosecution case against Kaltenbrunner was built on documents, overwhelmingly, deliberately, almost exclusively on documents. The lead American prosecutor, Justice Robert Jackson, had made the strategic decision early in the Nuremberg proceedings to rely on German documents wherever possible, rather than on witness testimony, on the grounds that documents could not be intimidated, could not recant, could not be impeached for personal interest or faulty memory. Documents had the additional advantage of being, in the context of the RSHA, extraordinarily numerous. The RSHA had been a bureaucracy of the most thorough kind. Every operation documented, every order recorded, every report compiled and filed and cross-referenced. The same institutional obsession with paperwork that made the Nazi state so efficient at killing also made it uniquely vulnerable to a documentary prosecution. Kaltenbrunner's prosecutors had thousands of relevant documents. They selected carefully. The specific charges against Kaltenbrunner fell into three categories. The first was the administration of the concentration camp system, his authority to commit and release prisoners, his issuance of orders for executions within the camps, his direct personal visits to camps including Mauthausen, where executions were performed in his presence. The second was his role in the implementation of the final solution, his communications with Eichmann's office, his lobbying for accelerated deportations, his presence at and involvement in the Hungarian operations of 1944. The third was his administration of the program of terror against political opponents in Germany and the occupied territories, the Bullet Decree against recaptured prisoners of war, the Nacht und Nebel decrees, under which resistance members in occupied Western Europe were transported to Germany and made to disappear without any official acknowledgement of their fate, and the interrogation and execution of those identified as involved in the July 20th conspiracy. Kaltenbrunner's defense strategy, developed with his court-appointed lawyer Kurt Kaufmann, was consistent with the story he had been constructing since his capture. He maintained, throughout, that his role had been essentially that of an intelligence official, that he had gathered and analyzed information, and that the operational and administrative functions attributed to him by the prosecution had actually been exercised by Himmler, Müller, or other Russia department chiefs, without his personal involvement or authorization. He denied signing specific orders that his own signature appeared on. He denied authorizing specific operations that the documentary record showed had been approved by his office. When confronted with documents bearing his name, he argued that his signature had been forged, that subordinates had used his name without authorization, or that the documents had been manufactured by the prosecution. This defense was heard, processed, and rejected by the tribunal with a thoroughness that the judgment makes clear. The most damaging single sequence of the trial against Kaltenbrunner was almost certainly the introduction of affidavit testimony from Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who described in detailed, procedural terms the relationship between the RSHA and the Auschwitz killing operations. Höss' affidavit documented the chain of command through which the extermination program had been authorized and sustained, tracing it directly to Himmler and, below Himmler, to the RSHA. Kaltenbrunner's defense attempted to limit the impact of this testimony by emphasizing that Höss named Himmler and Eichmann more directly than Kaltenbrunner in certain sequences. The tribunal did not find this persuasive. The RSHA chief's responsibility for the operations conducted by his office was not diminished by the fact that specific operational details had been handled by specific subordinates. The doctrine of command responsibility, that a senior commander is responsible for the foreseeable actions of those under his command, applied with full force. The cross-examination of Kaltenbrunner himself, conducted over several sessions by the prosecution, produced exchanges that became, in the historical literature, among the more extraordinary legal dialogues of the entire Nuremberg proceedings. Kaltenbrunner maintained his denials with a persistence that several contemporary observers found almost admirable in its tenacity and almost insulting in its contempt for the observable facts. He was confronted with document after document bearing his signature or his name. To each, he offered an explanation: forgery, unauthorized use, misattribution, context removed, that the prosecution systematically dismantled by introducing the surrounding documents that placed each piece in its administrative context. The exchange had a particular rhythm. The prosecution would introduce a document. Kaltenbrunner would deny it. and the prosecution would introduce 3 more documents that made the denial impossible. By the end of the cross-examination, the defense position had been reduced to the bare assertion that the entire documentary record was somehow unreliable, an assertion that the tribunal found unpersuasive in the extreme. His co-defendants watched him with a mix of reactions, documented in the psychological studies conducted on the Nuremberg prisoners. Some, particularly those who had their own interest in distancing themselves from the RSHA, were content to let Kaltenbrunner absorb the institutional responsibility for the security apparatus. Göring, characteristically, treated him with contemptuous distance. The former field commander and economic overlord of the Reich had always had complicated relations with the SS, and positioning himself as separate from the RSHA's operations was central to his own defense strategy. Albert Speer, who was constructing the most elaborate post-war persona of any Nuremberg defendant, maintained careful distance. Only a few of the defendants appeared to have any genuine solidarity with Kaltenbrunner, those whose own institutional connections to the RSHA were close enough that his fate and theirs were linked. Through all of it, the prosecution's methodical dismantling of his denials, the weight of the documentary evidence, the testimony from men whose names and files his own office had processed, Kaltenbrunner maintained the same controlled, deliberate, outwardly calm demeanor that had characterized his entire career. He did not break down. He did not confess. He did not express remorse or grief or any of the emotions that the world in the gallery might have hoped to see from a man being confronted with the human cost of his institutional decisions. He was the same man who had sat in his RSHA office signing papers, who had walked through Mauthausen's crematorium without visible distress, who had transmitted deportation orders across the continent with the measured professionalism of a man doing exactly the job he had been hired to do. The trial did not transform him. It only finally made visible, in a fully lit and internationally observed courtroom, the man who had always been there, the lawyer from Linz, who had decided, 20 years before, that the machinery of destruction was worth building and worth running, and who had never, in any documented word or act, changed his mind. Chapter 13. The Verdict. What the Tribunal Concluded. Underscore. The 1st of October 1946 was an autumn day in Nuremberg. Grey, cool, the kind of morning that settles into a city without announcement and stays. The Palace of Justice, where the International Military Tribunal had been conducting its proceedings for nearly 11 months, was surrounded by military personnel and civilian observers who had travelled from across the Allied zones to be present for a moment that history was already measuring as significant. Inside the courtroom, the 21 surviving defendants, one had died in custody, another had been ruled medically unfit to stand trial, sat in the dock in 2 rows, guarded, composed for the most part in the way that men compose themselves when they have run out of alternatives, and waited to hear what the 4 nations of the Allied powers had decided about them. The reading of the verdicts took most of the day. Each defendant's name was called. The charges were enumerated. The tribunal's findings were read into the formal record, and then the judgment, guilty or not guilty, on each count, was delivered. Kaltenbrunner's turn came in the afternoon. The tribunal read through the charges systematically: the crimes against peace, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and delivered its findings on each. On the count of crimes against peace, Kaltenbrunner was found not guilty. The tribunal had determined that the planning and initiation of aggressive war had been primarily the responsibility of the political leadership and military high command who had directed Germany's foreign policy before and during the war, and that Kaltenbrunner's role, while supportive of the overall regime, had not placed him among the primary architects of the war itself. This was not an acquittal in any meaningful sense. It was a precise legal finding about a specific charge. It did not reduce the weight of what followed. On the counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, the tribunal found Ernst Kaltenbrunner guilty on both. The findings were exhaustive, detailed, and grounded entirely in the documentary record that the prosecution had assembled over the preceding months. The tribunal's written judgment on Kaltenbrunner ran to several substantial pages, an unusual length for an individual defendant's findings, reflecting both the scope of the charges and the tribunal's evident determination to address his denials directly and systematically. The judgment noted, with a precision that made his defense position untenable in retrospect, that Kaltenbrunner had argued either that documents bearing his signature were not signed by him, or that they were signed without his knowledge of their contents, or that the operations they authorized were carried out without his personal direction. The tribunal then addressed each category of denial and rejected it on the basis of the surrounding documentary context. It found, specifically, that the evidence established beyond any reasonable legal doubt that Kaltenbrunner had exercised command authority over the concentration camp system, that he had issued orders for the killing of prisoners, including prisoners of war, in violation of the laws of war, that he had been directly involved in the acceleration of deportations of Jewish populations to the killing centers, and that he had personally witnessed and approved killing operations at Mauthausen. The judgment's treatment of Kaltenbrunner's intelligence function, his role as RSHA chief in the narrower sense of running the SD's intelligence operations, was notably brief. The tribunal was not particularly interested in the distinction Kaltenbrunner had been trying to draw between himself as an intelligence chief and the men beneath him who ran the operational killing machinery. The distinction did not survive scrutiny. The RSHA was a unified institution under a single command, and the command authority for all of its functions, intelligence, policing, security, and the administration of mass murder, was vested in the person of its chief. Kaltenbrunner was that person. The tribunal did not accept that an individual could administer a large bureaucratic killing apparatus without knowledge of what it did, and without bearing responsibility for its actions. That principle, the principle of command responsibility, was one of the foundational legal contributions of the Nuremberg proceedings, and its application to Kaltenbrunner was among its clearest and most fully documented expressions. The sentence was death by hanging. It was delivered to Kaltenbrunner in the same session. After the reading of the verdicts was complete, he received it without visible reaction. No dramatic outburst, no collapse, no expression of emotion that observers in the courtroom could document. He had known, or must have known, that this was the most likely outcome. The evidence against him was too comprehensive, his denials too thoroughly dismantled, his institutional role too precisely documented, for any other outcome to have been genuinely plausible. What observers noted instead was his posture, unchanged from the beginning of the proceedings to their end, the physical containment of a man who had spent his entire adult life in the discipline of a system that did not reward visible emotion. The sentence was noted. The session ended. The defendants were returned to their cells. 11 defendants received the death sentence at Nuremberg. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart, and Bormann, the last in absentia, his fate at the end of the war, unknown to the tribunal. 3 were sentenced to life imprisonment: Hess, Funk, and Raeder. 4 received terms of imprisonment ranging from 10 to 20 years: Dönitz, von Neurath, von Schirach, and Speer. 3 were acquitted: Schacht, von Papen, and Fritzsche. Verdicts that generated considerable public controversy, particularly in the case of Schacht, whose role in financing German rearmament had been central to the prosecution's case. Kaltenbrunner's sentence placed him among a group of 11 men, but within that group he occupied a distinct institutional position, the head of the security and intelligence apparatus, the man who had run the machinery of organized terror and mass murder from January 1943 to the Reich's final days. The appeals process available under the Nuremberg framework was limited. The tribunal had not been designed to accommodate extensive post-conviction review, and the Allied Control Council, which had the authority to review and modify sentences, was the final mechanism available to defendants who wished to contest their verdicts. Kaltenbrunner's lawyers submitted an application to the Allied Control Council requesting either a reduction in sentence or a new trial. The application argued that the documentary evidence had been misinterpreted, that the principle of command responsibility had been applied too broadly, and that Kaltenbrunner had been denied fair process due to his medical condition during the early stages of the proceedings. The Control Council reviewed the application and rejected it. The sentence stood. Several of the psychological assessments conducted during Kaltenbrunner's imprisonment at Nuremberg survive in the historical record and provide a portrait of the man behind the institutional function. The American prison psychologist Gustav Gilbert, who interviewed many of the defendants at length, found Kaltenbrunner among the more difficult subjects, not because he was hostile or aggressive, but because he was consistently evasive in a way that made genuine psychological contact almost impossible. Gilbert noted that Kaltenbrunner showed no genuine remorse, not the performed variety, not the strategic variety, not even the limited kind that a man might display when calculating that some appearance of contrition might influence the outcome. He simply did not engage with the question of what his decisions had meant for the millions of people processed by the system he ran. Gilbert classified this as a form of extreme compartmentalization, a psychological architecture in which the administrative function of the office had been so thoroughly separated from the human consequences of its actions that the man who had run it genuinely could not or would not connect the two. There were 3 judicial appeals to the Allied Control Council from Kaltenbrunner and his legal team in the weeks between the verdict and the scheduled execution. Each was reviewed, each was rejected. The formal legal process that had begun with his capture in the mountains above Altausee had run its course. The man who had administered the most powerful internal security and intelligence apparatus in the history of the modern state had been found guilty by an international tribunal of the highest crimes in the legal vocabulary available to that tribunal. The sentence was death. The date was set for the 16th of October 1946. 11 days remained. Those 11 days, in the cells of the Nuremberg prison, were observed by the prison chaplain, the psychologists, the guards, and the prison administration. Kaltenbrunner received visits from the Catholic chaplain, Father Sixtus O'Connor, a fact that has a particular irony given the thoroughness of his denial throughout the proceedings, since pastoral care in the face of death is typically premised on some acknowledgement of what one is being cared for. He spent time writing. He did not produce a written confession or a statement of remorse for the historical record. He remained, to the end, a man who had accepted the institutional logic of the system he served so completely that even in the final days of his life, with the verdict delivered and the sentence confirmed, he could not publicly step outside it. He had been the machine's most faithful servant. He died the machine's most silent prisoner. Chapter 14. The Execution. The Last Night. In Nuremberg. The gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison was not designed for the purpose to which it was put on the night of the 15th and into the early hours of the 16th of October, 1946. It was an ordinary institutional room, high-ceilinged, plain, with the functional architecture of a building designed for physical exercise rather than judicial finality. 3 wooden gallows had been constructed inside it, their platforms standing at the height of approximately 8 feet, the rope drops calculated, in theory, to produce rapid and certain death. The gymnasium would, over the course of that night, see 10 of the 11 condemned men brought to it in sequence. The 11th, Hermann Göring, had been found dead in his cell the previous evening, having concealed and swallowed a cyanide capsule at a moment that the prison's considerable security measures had somehow failed to prevent. His death by his own hand, hours before the scheduled execution, was the final act of the public performance he had maintained throughout the trial. A man unwilling to give the Allies the satisfaction of his death on their terms, in their venue, by their method. Kaltenbrunner was third in the sequence that night. Each man was brought from his cell in turn, escorted through the corridors of the prison by American military police, into the gymnasium, up the 13 steps of the gallows, and into the final procedures that the execution required. The process was conducted under tight security and in the presence of a small number of official witnesses, Allied military personnel, journalists selected to provide a public record, and the prison officials whose administrative function included documenting the deaths. Kaltenbrunner walked to the gallows with the same physical composure that he had maintained throughout his imprisonment. The large frame, the deliberate carriage, the face that had been marked since his student years by the scars he had always carried, like a declaration of hardness. He climbed the steps. The procedures were followed. The black hood was placed over his head. The execution of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, by hanging on the 16th of October 1946, did not proceed cleanly. The American military hangman, assigned to the executions that night, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, was later found to have been not particularly expert at his assignment. Historians and journalists who studied the Nuremberg executions in subsequent decades found evidence that multiple hangings that night involved longer deaths than the method theoretically required, that the drops and the knots in several cases did not produce the instantaneous death that a properly executed hanging should deliver. Whether Kaltenbrunner's death fell into this category cannot be stated with certainty from the documented record, and the script will not speculate beyond what sources establish. What the official documentation records is that he was pronounced dead by the prison physician a short time after the drop. His body, along with those of the other executed men, was transported to a crematorium in Munich. The ashes were scattered in the Isar River. No grave exists. No marker remains. By the design of the Allies, who were determined that the executed men's graves not become sites of commemoration or pilgrimage, the physical remains of Ernst Kaltenbrunner were dissolved into the geography of the country his movement had tried to remake in its own image. His last recorded words before the hood was placed over his head were brief and characteristic. He said that he had done his duty in the service of his people and his fatherland, and that he was content to die for it. The statement was not a confession. It was not an acknowledgement of the meaning of what he had administered. It was the final assertion of the same position he had maintained through the trial, through the appeals, through the prison chaplain's visits, and the psychologist's interviews, that what he had done had been duty, service, the performance of the function his station required. It was, in its own terrible way, the most honest statement he had made throughout the entire proceeding. He genuinely did not recognize a distinction between the duty he described and the crimes for which he was being executed. The ideology had absorbed the man so completely that the man could not, even at the last moment, see past it. The contrast between his end and the ends of some of his co-defendants is worth noting without dramatization. Göring's cyanide, Ribbentrop's visible terror on the platform, the different registers of emotion, defiance, contrition, and collapse that the various men displayed in the same gymnasium over the course of that same night. Kaltenbrunner's composure, observed by those present, was consistent with everything the trial and the imprisonment had shown about him. Not heroic, not admirable, but simply consistent. He was the same man at the end as he had been at the beginning. Whatever processes of reflection or revision that the 11 years between his joining the SS and the beginning of the war, or the 2.5 years he had spent running the RSHA, or the 11 months of trial, or the 11 final days of waiting, might have produced in another man, they had not produced them in him. He walked through the door he had built for himself, without looking back. The deaths of the 10 executed Nuremberg defendants that night marked the formal end of the most senior level of Nazi accountability. Other trials followed. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, under American authority, tried lower-ranking officials and specialists, the Einsatzgruppen commanders, the doctors who had conducted experiments on prisoners, the judges who had administered the Nazi legal system, the industrialists who had used slave labor, the military commanders who had ordered or permitted atrocities. These trials extended the principle of the First Nuremberg Tribunal, that individuals bear personal responsibility for the actions of the institutions they command and the systems they serve, into the middle levels of the Nazi hierarchy. They were important, and their record was significant. But the top level, the men who had been closest to the decisions and who had exercised the greatest institutional authority, had been accounted for, in a formal legal sense, in the first trial. Kaltenbrunner's death was part of that accounting. What the executions did not do, and it is important to state this clearly, because there is a tendency to treat formal legal accountability as a kind of resolution that it cannot actually provide, was restore or compensate for what had been destroyed. The millions of people who had died in the camps, in the shootings, on the death marches, in the mass graves of the eastern occupied territories, in the ghettos and the deportation trains, their deaths were not undone by the deaths of 11 men in a gymnasium in Nuremberg. Their families were not restored. Their communities were not reconstituted. Their cultural worlds, the Yiddish-speaking communities of Eastern Europe, the Sephardic communities of the Balkans and Greece, the urban professional Jewish communities of Vienna and Berlin and Prague, the intellectual and artistic networks that had been part of the fabric of European civilization, were gone. Legal accountability and historical reckoning are not the same thing as restoration, and the Nuremberg executions should not be remembered as though they were. They were a beginning, an attempt to establish, for the first time in history, that individuals who lead systems of mass murder can be held personally to account. They were not an ending. The body of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, dissolved in the Isar River, and therefore permanently beyond the reach of geography or memorial, represented the Allied determination that the men convicted at Nuremberg should leave no physical trace that could be used, as the shrine to the German defeat of 1918 had been used, to sustain a mythology of martyrdom and revenge. Whether that determination was wise as a policy is debated by historians of memory and commemoration. What is certain is that it was largely effective. There is no grave for Kaltenbrunner. There is no monument. There is no pilgrimage site. There is only the record, the extraordinary, detailed, overwhelming documentary record of what he did and how the world finally responded to it. The record is his only monument, and it is the most appropriate monument imaginable. The river received what the gallows left. The autumn morning of the 16th of October 1946 passed into afternoon, and the city of Nuremberg continued around it, damaged still from the years of bombing, beginning the slow reconstruction that would eventually make it one of the most visited cities in Germany, its Palace of Justice, a museum and memorial to the proceedings that had taken place there. The man who had helped build the machinery of the Reich's terror was gone. The work of understanding what he had built, and why, and how, that work was only beginning. Chapter 15. The Aftermath. What happened to the machine? The death of Ernst Kaltenbrunner in October 1946 did not dissolve the institution he had run. The RSHA had already been formally dissolved by Allied order In the immediate aftermath of the German surrender, its files seized, its buildings occupied, its personnel scattered across the prisoner of war camps and the Allied zones of occupation. But institutions do not dissolve simply because their legal existence is terminated. The people who had staffed the RSHA, the case officers, the section heads, the regional commanders, the specialists in interrogation and surveillance and deportation coordination, dispersed into the post-war landscape of a divided Germany and carried with them their training, their networks, and their knowledge. What happened to those people and to the institutional knowledge they embodied is one of the more complicated and less comfortable chapters in the post-war history of both Germany and the Western intelligence agencies. Some of the RSHA's most significant figures were tried and convicted at the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings. The Einsatzgruppen trial, one of the 12 Nuremberg follow-on trials conducted by the American military, tried the commanders of the mobile killing units that had operated in the East. The evidence presented included the operational reports submitted by the Einsatzgruppen to Russia headquarters in Berlin, reports that documented, in the Russia's own bureaucratic language, the number of people killed in each operation, the locations, the dates, the categories of victim. The reports had been filed, organized, and retained in Russia archives. They survived the war in Allied hands. They were among the most devastating single categories of documentary evidence presented at any Nuremberg proceeding. The commanders who had submitted those reports, and who now sat in the dock reading the documents they had written, were convicted. Several were executed. Adolf Eichmann, the man who had managed the deportation apparatus from his Russia subsection, the former Linz acquaintance whose relationship with Kaltenbrunner had been one of the operational mechanisms of the final solution, escaped the Allied net entirely in the immediate post-war period. He fled Germany using a network of false documents and underground escape routes that involved, among other elements, assistance from individuals within the Catholic Church's relief organizations, who were not always careful about who they were helping. Eichmann reached Argentina under a false identity in 1950, where he lived under the name Ricardo Clement for a decade, working in an ordinary industrial job, apparently convinced that distance and time had made him untouchable. He was located by the Israeli intelligence service Mossad, abducted from Buenos Aires in May of 1960, transported to Israel, tried before an Israeli court, and hanged in Ramla prison on the 31st of May, 1962. His trial, in which he notoriously described himself as a man who had simply followed orders and managed logistics without personal conviction about the meaning of what he was doing, produced one of the most influential historical and philosophical examinations of perpetrator psychology ever written. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief who had operated directly beneath Kaltenbrunner in the Russia's hierarchy, and who had been more operationally involved in many of the killing programs than Kaltenbrunner himself, was never found. He disappeared in the final days of the Battle of Berlin in late April and early May of 1945. His fate remains, genuinely and definitively, unknown. He was the most senior Nazi official never to be captured, tried, or confirmed dead. Various claims and theories emerged over the decades that he had been recruited by American or Soviet intelligence, that he had fled to South America, that he had died in Berlin in the final fighting. None were conclusively proven. A grave in a Berlin cemetery bearing his name was examined decades after the war and found to contain the remains of 3 different individuals, none of whom matched Müller's known physical characteristics. The man who had run the Gestapo under Kaltenbrunner had achieved what Kaltenbrunner himself had attempted: genuine disappearance. Unlike Kaltenbrunner, he was never found. Walter Schellenberg, the SD Foreign Intelligence chief who had been Kaltenbrunner's subordinate and rival, had a post-war trajectory that illustrated the Western intelligence agency's complicated relationship with RSHA personnel. Schellenberg was tried at the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings and convicted on charges related to his membership in the SS and his role in certain RSHA operations. He received a 6-year sentence, of which he served less than 2 before being released on medical grounds in 1951. He died of liver disease in Italy in 1952, having spent his final years writing his memoirs and cooperating with Western intelligence debriefers who were interested in his knowledge of Soviet intelligence methods and German wartime intelligence operations. His memoirs, published posthumously, presented a self-serving portrait of a man who had been a moderating influence within the RSHA, a characterization that subsequent historians found largely unsupported by the documentary record. The personnel of the RSHA's more specialized functions were absorbed, in numbers that historians have continued to document and debate, into the intelligence agencies of the emerging Cold War powers. Both American and West German intelligence services recruited former RSHA and Abwehr personnel during the late 1940s and through the 1950s, on the rationalization that their expertise in Soviet intelligence methods, Eastern European networks, and the human geography of the Soviet-controlled territories was too valuable to waste because of their wartime records. The most documented example was the Gehlen organization, the intelligence network established by former Wehrmacht military intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen, which was funded and supported by American intelligence and eventually became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Federal Intelligence Service of West Germany. The Gehlen organization employed numerous former RSHA personnel. The rationalization that operational necessity superseded accountability was one that had significant consequences for the thoroughness of West Germany's early post-war reckoning with the Nazi security apparatus. Mauthausen concentration camp, the facility in Upper Austria that Kaltenbrunner had helped found and had visited to observe its killing methods, was liberated by the United States Army on the 5th of May, 1945. American soldiers who entered the camp found thousands of surviving prisoners in extreme states of deprivation, alongside evidence of the systematic killing that had taken place there throughout the camp's years of operation. The camp was subsequently maintained as a memorial site, and it is today one of the most significant memorial museums in Austria, a place where the physical infrastructure of the camp has been preserved and documented, where the names of those who died there are recorded, and where the history of what happened there is taught to Austrian schoolchildren and international visitors. Austria's relationship with its own role in the Nazi system, the question of how much responsibility Austria bore as a co-perpetrator rather than merely a victim, was a source of significant historical controversy throughout the post-war decades. Kaltenbrunner's biography is one of the central exhibits in that argument. The man who ran the RSHA was Austrian, and the underground movement he had led for 7 years before the Anschluss was Austrian, and the camp he had helped found was built on Austrian soil. The fate of the RSHA's records, the surviving portion that was not destroyed in the final weeks of the war, is itself a significant chapter in the administrative history of the post-war period. The Allied powers each took custody of portions of the captured German documentary archive, and the process of cataloguing, analyzing, and eventually making public those records extended over decades. Some RSHA documents were declassified and made publicly available for historical research relatively quickly. Others remained classified in various national archives for years or decades, emerging gradually into the historical record as declassification programs progressed. The full picture of RSHA operations, including the scope of Kaltenbrunner's personal authority and the extent of his direct involvement in specific programs, became clearer as each successive tranche of documents became available. The history of the period has continued to be revised and refined as the documentary record has expanded. The Nuremberg Principles, The legal framework developed in the IMT proceedings to establish individual criminal responsibility for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity became the foundational text for the development of international criminal law in the post-war era. They were incorporated into the work of the United Nations International Law Commission, which formalized them in 1950. They underpinned the legal framework of subsequent international tribunals, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in the same period, and the International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in the early years of the 21st century. Kaltenbrunner's trial, and the principle of command responsibility, developed and applied in his case, is part of the legal foundation of every subsequent effort to hold individuals accountable for systematic crimes committed through state or quasi-state institutions. The man is gone. The legal principle established in his trial endures. Austria took many decades to fully and publicly reckon with the Austrian dimension of the Nazi enterprise. The dominant post-war Austrian narrative, the so-called victim myth, which positioned Austria as Hitler's first victim rather than as a co-participant in the Reich's crimes, shielded Austrian society from the kind of systematic self-examination that West Germany undertook more promptly and more thoroughly. The myth was not entirely invented. Austria had been annexed, Austrians had resisted, and Austrian suffering during the war had been real. But the myth, in its political deployment, served to deflect the question of Austrian perpetrators, of whom Kaltenbrunner was the most prominent, but far from the only significant example. The gradual dismantling of the victim myth, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s and 2000s, was one of the more significant developments in Austrian public life and historical consciousness of the late 20th century. The name of Ernst Kaltenbrunner and what it represents was part of that reckoning. Chapter 16, The Psychology, How a Lawyer Became an Architect of Terror. The question that every serious account of Ernst Kaltenbrunner must eventually confront is not the what, but the how, not what he did. The documentary record on that question is exhaustive, but how a boy raised in a modest Austrian provincial household, educated in law, professionally qualified, intellectually capable, became the man who ran the Gestapo and administered the machinery of mass murder. This is not a comfortable question to ask, because the honest answers are more disturbing than the simple proposition that some people are born evil and that great crimes are committed only by monsters. The answers that serious historians and psychologists have offered in the decades since the war's end suggest something harder to bear, that Kaltenbrunner was, in the most structurally meaningful sense, a product, a man assembled by forces that were not unique to him, produced by a culture and a historical moment that created many men like him, and shaped by a system that rewarded exactly the qualities he possessed. The Austrian political and cultural environment of the early 20th century, the pan-German nationalism, the anti-Semitic currents embedded in the mainstream of provincial social life, the university fraternities with their rituals of masculine toughness and their rehearsed contempt for weakness, provided the basic material. Kaltenbrunner did not invent his ideology. He absorbed it from his father's household, from the Linz Gymnasium, from the Graz University fraternities, from the reading that circulated in those environments, pamphlets and tracts, and the popular nationalist literature that framed European history as a racial competition in which the German-speaking peoples occupied a special and threatened position. This ideology was not the private property of a small group of fanatics. It was ambient, present in the social atmosphere of a specific class, in a specific region, at a specific historical moment. Kaltenbrunner breathed it as he breathed the air. What distinguished him from the many other men who breathed the same air and did not become what he became was a combination of temperament and circumstance. The temperament, a capacity for organized patience, a tolerance for sustained personal risk, a need for belonging that the underground SS satisfied in ways that conventional professional life could not, and, critically, an absence of the internal friction that most people experience when the ideology they hold abstractly is put into concrete human practice. Many people who hold extreme views in the abstract cannot translate them into direct action against individual human beings when the moment arrives. That friction, the recognition of the specific human in front of you, rather than the abstract category, is a moral break. It does not always hold, but it exists for most people. The historical and psychological evidence from Kaltenbrunner's documented behavior, the Mauthausen visit, the deportation orders, the consistency of his denial at Nuremberg, suggests that this friction was, for him, either very weak or entirely absent. The circumstance, the historical moment of the 1930s, delivered to a man with Kaltenbrunner's temperament and ideology, an opportunity structure that made his trajectory possible. The collapse of democratic institutions, the economic catastrophe of the Depression, the weakness of the Austrian state in the face of German pressure, the specific role that the SS underground gave to competent regional organizers, all of these created a ladder that a man with his qualities could climb. In a different historical moment, in a stable democracy with functioning institutions and a healthy civic culture, Kaltenbrunner's qualities might have found expression in an ordinary legal career or in provincial politics. The ideology he held would have remained abstract, constrained by institutional norms and the checks of a functioning society. The man he became was not inevitable. He was contingent, produced by the intersection of a particular personality and a particular historical catastrophe. Psychologist Gustav Gilbert's assessments of Kaltenbrunner during the Nuremberg proceedings identified several characteristics that he found consistent across his interactions with the defendant. The compartmentalization, the inability or unwillingness to connect administrative functions with their human meaning, was the most prominent. But Gilbert also noted a kind of moral autism that went deeper than simple denial. Kaltenbrunner appeared genuinely unable to engage with the subjective experience of the people his decisions had affected. Not that he was unaware intellectually that people had suffered and died. He knew the numbers as well as anyone, but he could not or would not access the meaning of those numbers in terms of individual human experience. The intelligence reports, the deportation statistics, the camp population figures. These were data points in an administrative picture, not representations of human beings who had possessed lives, families, desires, and futures. This capacity, or rather incapacity, is not unique to Kaltenbrunner. It appears across the documented psychology of multiple Nuremberg defendants and has been extensively analyzed in the literature on perpetrator psychology since. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, developed the concept she famously described as the banality of evil, the observation that great crimes can be perpetrated not only by monsters motivated by hatred, but by ordinary bureaucratic people who are simply doing their job, following orders, performing functions within a system without engaging with the moral meaning of what the system produces. Arendt's analysis was specifically directed at Eichmann, and it has been significantly debated and refined by historians in the decades since. But the concept has obvious relevance to Kaltenbrunner as well, with one important qualification. Kaltenbrunner was not, in the sense that Arendt described Eichmann, simply a man without opinions or personal conviction. He had opinions, he had ideology, he had genuine belief. He was not empty of personal investment in what the regime was doing. He was fully committed to it. The bureaucratic routinization of mass murder was, in his case, not the absence of ideology, but the expression of it. The system ran smoothly because the man at the top believed in what the system was doing and had no internal conflict about keeping it running. The broader question of how entire societies participate in, or fail to resist, systematic crimes committed in their name is one that Kaltenbrunner's history raises, but does not resolve. The Austrian society that produced him did not produce only him. It produced the thousands of officials, guards, policemen, administrators, railway workers, and ordinary civilians who performed the functions the regime required at every level of the hierarchy. The question of individual moral agency within a totalitarian system, how much space existed for refusal, for resistance, for the ordinary human act of deciding that an order was wrong and declining to execute it, is one that historians have been examining and debating since the war ended. The evidence is complicated. Some people refused, some people helped, many did not. The factors that determined which category a specific individual fell into are not reducible to a simple formula of character or circumstance. They were both. But the existence of refusal, even limited, even dangerous, even exceptional, means that the choice was real. Those who made the other choice made a choice. Kaltenbrunner made his choice repeatedly, over 2 decades, with full awareness of what each iteration of that choice meant. What does the psychology of Kaltenbrunner tell us that is useful for understanding not just this specific historical episode, but the broader human capacity for the kind of institutional participation in mass crime that the Nazi period represents? The first and most important lesson is that the capacity is not exotic. It does not require a specific type of person that can be identified and excluded from positions of authority by careful screening. It requires ordinary human qualities: organization, patience, loyalty, professional competence, redirected by ideology and institutional structure toward destructive ends. The second lesson is that the institutional structure matters enormously. The SS provided Kaltenbrunner with a community, a hierarchy, a reward system, and a set of social norms that defined his behavior as virtuous, and the alternative behavior, refusal, resistance, moral scruple, as weakness. The third lesson is that the ideology that provided the justification, the framing of mass murder as racial self-defense, as historical necessity, as the painful performance of a duty owed to the Volk, did real psychological work. It allowed otherwise ordinary men to perform extraordinary crimes by convincing them that the crimes were not crimes at all, but the actions of responsible, courageous servants of their people and their time. None of these lessons are comfortable. All of them are necessary. The history of Ernst Kaltenbrunner is not useful as a reassuring story about a unique monster who was identified and destroyed by the forces of justice. It is useful as a precise, documented case study in how ideology, institution, and individual temperament combine to produce the conditions for mass crime, and as a warning about the continuing importance of maintaining the institutional structures, the civic cultures, and the moral frameworks that prevent those conditions from forming again. Athen. Chapter 17. The Legacy. How History Remembers and Misremembers. _ The historical memory of Ernst Kaltenbrunner has followed a pattern that is common to the second tier of Nazi leadership. Men who wielded enormous institutional power during the war, but who lacked the public profile of figures like Hitler, Göring, or Himmler. For decades after the war, Kaltenbrunner was known primarily to specialists, to historians of the SS and the RSHA, to legal scholars studying the Nuremberg proceedings, to researchers focused specifically on the administrative mechanisms of the Holocaust. For the general public, in Germany and Austria and internationally, his name was far less familiar than those of men whose institutional power had been smaller, but whose public presence had been larger. The consequence of this asymmetry is that the history of what the RSHA actually did, the specific mechanisms through which the final solution was administered, the intelligence operations, the terror against political opponents, has been less thoroughly embedded in popular historical consciousness than the history of the decisions that preceded it. The scholarly literature on Kaltenbrunner is less extensive than one might expect, given the scope of his institutional responsibility. Peter Black's biography, published in 1984 under the title Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Ideological Soldier of the Third Reich, remains the most comprehensive single treatment of his life and career, and historians writing about the RSHA and the Final Solution's administrative history continue to cite it as the essential reference. Black's work drew on the Nuremberg documentary record, captured RSHA files, the CIA's post-war intelligence assessment of Kaltenbrunner's final days, and the testimony of former RSHA personnel interviewed after the war. The picture it presents is of a man more ideologically committed and more personally engaged in the RSHA's killing operations than the trial's focus on documentary evidence fully conveyed. A man who was not merely administering an institution he had inherited, but actively driving it in the direction his convictions demanded. Austria's historical engagement with Kaltenbrunner has been, as with other elements of its Nazi-era history, complicated and delayed. For the decades when the victim myth provided the dominant Austrian public narrative of the war period, Kaltenbrunner was an inconvenient figure, an Austrian who had not been a victim, but a perpetrator of the highest order, whose career demolished the narrative of a nation that had simply suffered German occupation. His presence in the historical record was acknowledged in academic contexts, but rarely foregrounded in public commemoration or school curricula in the way that his institutional significance warranted. The reforms to Austrian historical education that began in the late 1980s and continued through the following decades brought his story more prominently into the public record. The Mauthausen Memorial, the site he had helped found, became one of the central institutions of Austrian Holocaust memory, and his role in the camp's establishment and his visits to witness its killing operations were documented and taught as part of Austria's own engagement with its perpetrator history. The figure of Kaltenbrunner has appeared in a relatively small number of dramatic treatments, films, television productions, theatrical works, compared with other Nazi leaders, largely because his public invisibility during the war years left less dramatic narrative material for fiction to work with. He appears as a secondary character in films about the Nuremberg Trials and in some productions dealing with the final days of the Reich, usually depicted in the physical terms that his documented appearance makes natural, the tall, scarred figure of institutional menace. These depictions, whatever their dramatic quality, face the fundamental problem of all dramatizations of historical perpetrators: the temptation to find or invent psychological complexity that makes the dramatic character more interesting than the historical record supports. In Kaltenbrunner's case, the historical record is itself complex enough that this temptation can be resisted without sacrificing narrative interest. The real man is more revealing than any invented version of him. The question of how institutions like the RSHA should be taught and remembered as historical phenomena that have been permanently defeated, or as case studies in institutional dangers that remain relevant, is one that the anniversary commemorations of the Nuremberg Trials, which fall in this period, continue to raise. The 75th anniversary of the executions, in October of 2021, was marked in several countries with renewed scholarship, documentary production, and public commemoration, focused not only on the defendants, but on the specific institutional mechanisms through which they had exercised power. The RSHA, as a model of how intelligence, policing, and security functions, can be unified under ideological direction and used as an instrument of mass crime, received particular scholarly attention in that period. Kaltenbrunner's role as the institution's second and final chief was examined in that context, with a precision and completeness that his relative public obscurity had previously prevented. The Nuremberg principles he helped bring into being, through the prosecution of his crimes and the legal framework developed to address them, have had a complicated life in the decades since their formulation. The International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute and operational since 2002, represents the most ambitious institutionalization of those principles, providing a permanent international forum for the prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Its record over its first 2 decades of operation has been mixed, marked by significant convictions and significant failures, by the political complications inherent in a court that depends on state cooperation and that has been accused of selective application of its mandate. But the underlying principle that individuals who lead systems of mass crime cannot hide behind the authority of the state they served or the orders they received is now embedded in international law in a way that it was not before the Nuremberg proceedings. Kaltenbrunner's trial contributed to that embedding. The legacy of the RSHA as an institutional model has received specific scholarly and policy attention in the context of debates about the appropriate structure of modern security services. The unification of intelligence, policing, and security functions under a single command, which Kaltenbrunner completed when he absorbed the Abwehr in 1944, is recognized in security studies literature as a structural configuration that poses specific risks when the political environment in which it operates abandons legal and ethical constraints. The separation of functions, maintaining distinct institutional cultures, independent oversight, and legal boundaries between domestic intelligence, foreign intelligence, law enforcement, and military security is understood, in the light of the RSHA's history, as a structural protection against the concentration of coercive power that enables systems like the one Kaltenbrunner ran. This is not an abstract historical lesson. It is a practical institutional principle that democratic governments continue to manage and debate. The specific location of Kaltenbrunner's capture, the mountains above Altausee, in the Austrian Salzkammergut, has acquired a particular layered resonance in the post-war period, because it is also the location of the salt mines where the Nazi-looted art collection was stored. The two stories, the hiding security chief and the hidden cultural treasures, intersected in the same geography in the final days of the war, and the contrast they embody is striking. On one side of the mountain, men were trying to preserve what civilization had created. In the hunting cabin above the village, a man who had helped destroy millions of the people who created it was hiding from the consequences. The mountains absorbed both stories. The art was recovered. The man was found. The mountains remained. Kaltenbrunner left 3 children, 2 sons from his first marriage to Maria Huber, and a daughter born to his mistress, Gisela von Westarp. The lives of the children of senior Nazis, how they managed the knowledge of what their fathers had done, how they incorporated that knowledge into their own identities, how they related to the communities and institutions that bore the weight of their fathers' actions, is a subject of growing historical and psychological attention. The Kaltenbrunner children were young when the war ended, and the historical record of their post-war lives is limited in the sources available. What is documented is that the weight of a father's history as the head of the Gestapo and the RSHA is not a legacy that resolves itself simply or quickly. It is carried differently by each individual, across generations. It is part of the broader ongoing human reckoning with what the Nazi period did to European society and to the families, perpetrators' families, as much as victims' families, who had to continue living in its aftermath. Chapter 18. The Long Reckoning. Why Ernst Kaltenbrunner Still Matters. We have spent 17 chapters following one man from a small Austrian town, through the underground SS, through the Anschluss, through the corridors of power of the Russia, through the courtroom at Nuremberg, and to the gymnasium, where his life ended on a cold October morning. It is a long journey, and the question that a thoughtful person arrives at by the end of it is both simple and difficult. Why does it matter now? What is the use of this history for people living in the 21st century, in a world that is in many ways radically different from the one that produced Ernst Kaltenbrunner and the system he served? The question is not rhetorical. It deserves a genuine answer. And the answer is not that the past will repeat itself in the same form, or that specific historical parallels are available for mechanical application to the present. The answer is subtler and more demanding. Kaltenbrunner matters because he is a test case for something that human beings persistently want to believe is not true, that great institutional evil can be traced to specific individual choices made by specific identifiable people within specific institutional structures in response to specific ideological commitments. We want the alternative story. We want to believe that disasters of this scale are forces of nature, historical weather systems, too large to have been produced by human decisions, and therefore too large to be prevented by them. The documentation of what Kaltenbrunner did, and how he did it, and what the specific chain of decisions and authority looked like at each step, resists that desire. It insists on the specificity of human choice. He chose repeatedly. He chose with knowledge, with capability, and with alternatives. The documentation of that choice is the most important thing his history leaves us with. The RSHA under Kaltenbrunner represented the most thorough institutionalization of ideological violence in the history of the modern state, a point worth dwelling on. The state machinery of organized violence is a feature of all modern states, not only totalitarian ones. Police forces, intelligence services, military organizations, detention systems, these exist in every contemporary society, and they exist because the state's monopoly on legitimate force is a necessary condition for the functioning of civil order. The question that the RSHA's history raises is not whether states should have security institutions, but what structural, legal, and cultural conditions are required to ensure that those institutions remain within the limits of legality and respect for human rights. The RSHA crossed every one of those limits. Understanding precisely how the crossing happened, not as a metaphor but in the specific institutional detail of the organization Kaltenbrunner headed, is an exercise that remains relevant for anyone who thinks seriously about the governance of security institutions. The Holocaust, of which the RSHA was the central administrative instrument under Kaltenbrunner's leadership, occupies a specific and necessary position in human moral and historical memory. The deliberate, systematic, industrially organized attempt to murder every Jew in Europe, the most exhaustively documented genocide in history, was not a natural disaster or an inevitable outcome of historical forces. It was a policy, implemented through institutions, authorized through chains of command, carried out by individuals who made specific choices at every level of the hierarchy. The Nuremberg Trials attempted to establish this truth in legal terms. The subsequent decades of Holocaust research, documentation, and memorialization have established it in historical terms. The ongoing work of memory, in schools, in museums, in films and books, and testimony and archive, exists because the recognition of this truth must be continually renewed. Each generation that encounters this history for the first time must make its own reckoning with it, Kaltenbrunner's story also raises a question about professional ethics that has not lost its relevance. He was a lawyer. He had been trained in the principles of justice, in the doctrines that define the rights of individuals against the power of the state, in the traditions of legal reasoning that the civilization he was born into had developed over centuries. He used that training, first, to protect his illegal movement from the legal system that was pursuing it, and then to provide intellectual cover for the administrative actions of the most lawless state in European history. The misuse of professional training in the service of institutional evil, the doctor who performed camp experiments, the engineer who designed the crematoria, the lawyer who drafted the legal framework for racial persecution, is one of the most specific and disturbing dimensions of the Nazi period's professional history. It is a dimension that professional ethics education in medicine, law, engineering, and other disciplines has engaged with seriously in the post-war period, precisely because the Nazi period demonstrated that professional competence provides no automatic protection against moral catastrophe. The 43 years of Ernst Kaltenbrunner's life, from the 4th of October 1903 to the 16th of October 1946, trace an arc that is, in retrospect, almost geometrically precise in its shape. The ascent follows the rise of the movement he served. The peak coincides exactly with the greatest extension of that movement's power. The descent maps perfectly onto the military and moral collapse of the Reich he administered. There is no mystery in the shape of the arc, no accident or contingency in its final destination. The choice he made in October of 1930 to join the Nazi Party, and the choice he remade every day thereafter, with escalating consequences and escalating stakes, led with the logic of a proof to the gymnasium in Nuremberg. The law he had studied could not protect him from the law he had violated. The system he had served could not protect him from the system that replaced it. What he had built could not survive the reckoning that the world, after everything, still had the capacity to demand. The families of those who died in the system Kaltenbrunner administered, in the camps, in the gas chambers, in the mass graves, on the death marches, in the cellars of Gestapo interrogation offices across occupied Europe, did not have the luxury of a long historical perspective in the immediate post-war years. They had loss. They had absence. They had the specific, irreducible human fact of people who were no longer there, the historical documentation, the legal proceedings, the scholarly analysis, the philosophical reflection. All of it exists at a distance from that specific, irreducible fact that cannot be entirely bridged. The effort to bridge it, through testimony, through memorial, through the transmission of the names and stories of the dead across generations, is the other side of the historical reckoning. It is not the same work as the institutional and political analysis, but it is equally necessary, perhaps more so. The salt mines of Altaussee, from which the stolen art of European civilization was recovered in the spring of 1945, are open today as a visitor attraction, a geological and historical site where tourists descend into the same tunnels where the masterworks were hidden. The mountains above the village are beautiful in the way that the Austrian Salzkammergut has always been beautiful, a beauty so complete and indifferent to human events that it continues unchanged whether the events are terrible or ordinary. A hunting cabin high on the slopes, reachable by a rough track, is no longer remarkable in any visible way. The arrest that happened there did not leave a physical mark. The mountains absorbed it, as they absorbed everything else. But the record did not dissolve into the river with the ashes. The record survived, in boxes, in Allied archives, in the testimonies of survivors and witnesses, in the proceedings of the International Military Tribunal, in the scholarship of historians who spent their careers making sure that the bureaucratic language of the RSHA's paperwork was translated accurately and without mitigation into the human terms that it had been designed to conceal. The record is what we have, and the record, all 32 million pages of it captured from Nazi administration, all the testimony, all the photographs, all the names on all the lists, says clearly and without ambiguity what Ernst Kaltenbrunner was, what he did, and what the world, at the cost of everything, eventually decided to do about it. This documentary has now run its full length, 18 chapters, from a boy born beside a river in Upper Austria to a man executed in a gymnasium in Bavaria, and through everything that connected those two moments, the choices made and unmade, the institutions built and destroyed, the millions of lives administered out of existence by a bureaucracy that a lawyer from Linz ran with professional dedication and ideological conviction for 2.5 years, at the center of the worst state in modern history. Sleep well. Rest in the knowledge that this history was documented, was tried, and was recorded in full, so that the reckoning, however incomplete, did happen, and so that the work of ensuring it is remembered and understood and used to keep its repetition from ever becoming possible again, that work continues.